Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It truly makes a difference in allowing us to keep creating these deep dive documentaries for you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content and haven't already, consider subscribing. It means the world. A massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting tonight's story. This one is truly something special. Now, let's begin. There are moments in life when something impossible feels undeniably real. A place you've never been that somehow feels like home. A face you've never seen that you seem to recognise. A language you've never learned that sounds strangely familiar. Most of us dismiss these sensations as tricks of the mind, fragments of dreams, or coincidences woven together by pattern-seeking brains, desperate to find meaning in chaos. But what if they aren't tricks at all? What if some people don't just believe in past lives? They remember them with the same clarity you remember yesterday. What if consciousness doesn't begin at birth and end at death, but continues in ways we've been trained not to see, not to acknowledge, not to take seriously? Tonight we explore one of the most documented and unsettling cases of claimed reincarnation in modern history. A woman born in early 20th century London who insisted from the moment she could speak that she belonged to a world 3,000 years gone. A woman who could navigate ancient temples she had never visited in this lifetime. A woman whose knowledge baffled professional Egyptologists and whose memories remained consistent, detailed and verifiable across 7 decades of life. Her name was Dorothy Eady. To the world of Egyptology, she became known as Seti. To conspiracy theorists and researchers of consciousness, she represents something far more profound. Potential proof that we are more than these bodies, more than these single lives, more than the materialist worldview allows us to believe. And her story asks a question that neither science nor religion has comfortably answered. A question that touches something deep and unsettling in all of us. What if the past is not behind us at all, but inside us, encoded in ways we don't understand, waiting to be remembered by those rare individuals whose consciousness refuses to forget? What if Dorothy Eady really was telling the truth? Chapter 1. A child who should have died, Dorothy Louise Eady was born on January 16th, 1904, in the London suburb of Blackheath. The address was unremarkable. A narrow brick row house on a quiet street where everyone knew everyone else's business and nothing extraordinary ever happened. Her parents were Reuben Ernest Eady and Carolyn Mary Eady, middle-class people who worked hard, attended church on Sundays, and expected their daughter to grow up to be a respectable Englishwoman. Reuben was a tailor by trade, a man who spent his days bent over fabric, making precise measurements, stitching seams with the kind of attention to detail that came from years of practice. Carolyn kept the household, managed the modest finances, and raised Dorothy with the firm but loving hand typical of Edwardian mothers. There was nothing mystical about them. No family history of psychic phenomena, no interest in spiritualism or the occult, no exposure to Eastern religions that taught reincarnation as doctrine. They were, by all accounts, as ordinary could be. Dorothy herself was an unremarkable infant. She cried when she was hungry, slept when she was tired, and showed no signs of being anything other than a perfectly normal English baby. She learned to walk at the expected age, began forming words around her first birthday, and seemed to be developing exactly as a child should. The family had no reason to expect anything unusual, no reason to prepare for what was coming until she died. Or at least, that's what the doctor believed had happened on that cold afternoon in 1907. Dorothy was 3 years old. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary house. Caroline was downstairs in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. Reuben was at his shop working on an order that needed to be finished by the end of the week. Dorothy was upstairs playing in the hallway outside her bedroom. No one knows exactly what happened, whether she tripped, lost her balance, or simply misjudged the distance. But somehow, Dorothy fell. The staircase in the Edie home was steep and narrow, the kind of Victorian construction that valued space efficiency over safety. 13 steps from top to bottom, each one covered in worn carpet that did nothing to soften the impact. Dorothy tumbled from the very top, her small body striking each step on the way down, her head hitting the hardwood of the banister, her limbs flailing uselessly as gravity pulled her toward the ground floor. The sound brought Caroline running from the kitchen. She found her daughter at the bottom of the stairs, motionless, crumpled in a way that made Caroline's heart stop. Dorothy's skin was pale, almost grey. Her breathing was so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. Her eyes were closed, and she didn't respond when Caroline called her name, shook her shoulders, held her close and begged her to wake up. Caroline screamed for a neighbour who ran to fetch the doctor. In those days there were no ambulances for ordinary families, no emergency services to call. You sent someone running, and you waited, and you prayed that the doctor would arrive in time. The doctor who came was a local physician who'd been treating the Edie family for years. His name has been lost to history, but his actions that day have not. He arrived within 20 minutes, black bag in hand, his expression already grim as he took in the scene. He examined Dorothy carefully, methodically. He checked her pulse at her wrist, then at her neck. He listened to her chest with his stethoscope, the cold metal pressed against her small rib cage. He lifted her eyelids, checking for response. He pressed gently on her limbs, searching for obvious breaks. After several long minutes, he straightened up and turned to Caroline and the neighbour, who had stayed to help. His face was sombre, his voice quiet but certain. The child had not survived the fall. Her injuries were too severe. She was gone. Caroline collapsed. The neighbour caught her before she hit the floor. The doctor remained professional, clinical, but inside he felt the weight of delivering this news to yet another family. Child mortality was common in those days, but it never got easier. He told Caroline he would need to return with the proper paperwork to make the death official. He expressed his condolences. He gathered his bag and left to make the necessary arrangements. The house filled with the kind of grief that has no sound. Caroline sat on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, cradling Dorothy's body, rocking back and forth, unable to accept what had just happened. The neighbour stayed with her, helpless, not knowing what to say or do in the face of such sudden, absolute loss. When Reuben came home and learned what had happened, he fell apart. He held his wife and his daughter, and they waited for the doctor to return. But when the doctor walked back through that door an hour later, he found something impossible. Dorothy was sitting up. She was awake. She was breathing normally, her colour returned, her eyes open and alert. She looked confused by all the attention, by her mother's tear-stained face, by the doctor's stunned expression. The physician stood frozen in the doorway, his paperwork still in his hand, staring at a child who should have been dead. He approached slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. He examined her again, more thoroughly this time, searching desperately for some explanation, some sign that he had been mistaken in his initial assessment. But there was nothing. No head injury, no broken bones, no internal bleeding. Dorothy was completely, impossibly unharmed. The doctor had no explanation. He quietly revised his assessment, told the parents that perhaps he had been mistaken, that the shock of the fall had rendered the child unconscious but not deceased. He left quickly, unsettled, unwilling to dwell on what had just happened or what it might mean. Reuben and Caroline were too relieved to question it. Their daughter was alive. That was all that mattered. But in the days and weeks that followed, they began to realise that something had changed. Dorothy had come back, yes, but she had not come back the same. The differences were subtle at first. She became quieter, more withdrawn, spending long periods sitting motionless and staring at nothing in particular. When her parents spoke to her, she often didn't respond immediately, as if she had to pull herself back from somewhere far away before she could engage with them. She stopped playing with her toys the way she used to. She stopped singing the little songs her mother had taught her. Instead, she began asking questions. Strange questions. Disturbing questions. She would ask her mother why the house was so dark, why the ceilings were so low, why there were no columns. Carolyn would explain that this was simply how English houses were built, but Dorothy would shake her head, frustrated, as if her mother was being deliberately obtuse. She would ask why it was always so cold, why the sun never felt warm the way it should. She would complain about the dampness, the grey skies, the rain that fell constantly and seemed to seep into everything. And she would cry, suddenly and without apparent reason, tears streaming down her face as she told her mother she wanted to go home. Carolyn would comfort her, reminding her gently that she was home. But Dorothy would pull away, shaking her head insistently. "No," she would say, "not this home. My real home." When asked where that was, she couldn't articulate it. She was only 3 years old, her vocabulary limited, her ability to express complex ideas still developing. But the longing in her voice was unmistakable, visceral, heartbreaking. She spoke of a place with tall buildings, with stone that felt warm under the sun, with open spaces and bright light that never seemed to end. Her parents began to worry that the fall had damaged her brain in some way that wasn't physically visible. They consulted the doctor again, but he found nothing wrong. Dorothy was healthy, intelligent, responsive. She simply seemed convinced that she belonged somewhere else. As the months passed, the conviction only grew stronger. By the time she was 4 years old, Dorothy had begun drawing pictures. Not the crude stick figures and shapeless blobs typical of a child her age, but detailed architectural sketches. She drew buildings with massive pillars that reached toward the sky. She drew courtyards with geometric precision. She drew symbols that looked like letters, but weren't part of any alphabet her parents recognized. She drew these images obsessively, filling page after page with structures that couldn't possibly exist in her limited experience of the world. When her parents asked what she was drawing, she would tell them simply, "Home." Carolyn began to suspect that Dorothy had somehow encountered images or stories that had captured her imagination, that she was mimicking something she had seen in a book or heard in a story. But there were no such books in the Edie household. They owned a Bible, a few novels and some practical manuals, nothing about ancient civilizations or foreign lands. By the time Dorothy was 5, her behaviour had become concerning enough that Reuben and Carolyn sought advice from their parish priest. The priest listened patiently to their description of Dorothy's obsessions, her drawings, her insistence that she belonged somewhere else. He suggested that the child was experiencing a spiritual crisis, perhaps the result of a demonic influence introduced during the moment when she had been unconscious after her fall. The priest offered to perform a blessing. The Edis agreed, desperate for any explanation, as to solution. The priest came to their home, said prayers over Dorothy, sprinkled holy water, and instructed her parents to bring her to church regularly to reinforce her Christian faith. But the blessing changed nothing. Dorothy continued to draw her temples, continued to speak of her real home, continued to exist in a state of profound displacement that nothing seemed able to resolve. Her parents didn't know what else to do, so they did what parents have always done when faced with something they don't understand. They waited, hoped she would grow out of it, and tried to maintain as normal a life as possible. But Dorothy would never grow out of it, because what she was experiencing wasn't imagination, wasn't fantasy, wasn't the lingering effect of trauma. It was memory, and memory, once awakened, does not simply fade away. Chapter 2. The Temple She Recognized. As Dorothy grew older, her obsession with the place she called home intensified rather than diminished. By the time she was 6 years old, she had become fixated on finding images that matched the structures in her mind. She would spend hours poring over whatever books and magazines she could find, searching desperately for something that would confirm what she remembered. Her parents tried to redirect her attention toward more appropriate interests for a young English girl: sewing, music, domestic skills. But Dorothy had no patience for these things. She was polite about it, but firm. She wasn't interested in becoming the kind of woman her parents wanted her to be. She was interested in finding out where she really belonged. The breakthrough came when Dorothy was 7 years old, during what was meant to be a pleasant family outing. The British Museum had become one of London's premier attractions by the early 20th century, its halls filled with treasures plundered from across the empire. Egyptian artefacts were particularly popular, drawing crowds who were fascinated by the mystery and exoticism of ancient civilizations. The museum advertised itself as an educational institution, a place where ordinary British citizens could encounter the glories of human history without ever leaving London. For Reuben and Caroline, taking Dorothy to the museum seemed like a perfect way to broaden her horizons, to expose her to culture and learning in a controlled, respectable environment. They hoped that seeing real historical artefacts might satisfy whatever strange curiosity had taken hold of their daughter, that it might help her understand that the past was just that. Past, distant, separate from her actual life. They could not have been more wrong. The family took the train into central London on a Saturday morning in April of 1911. It was a clear day, unusual for London, with weak sunlight filtering through the perpetual haze of coal smoke that hung over the city. They walked from the station to the museum, Dorothy between her parents, each holding one of her hands. Dorothy was quiet during the journey, but Caroline noticed that her daughter seemed tense, almost vibrating with anticipation, though she couldn't have explained what she was anticipating. When they arrived at the museum's imposing neoclassical facade, Dorothy stopped walking and stared up at the building, her expression unreadable. Inside, the museum was crowded with weekend visitors. Families moved through the galleries in clusters, parents attempting to keep children interested while absorbing as much culture as time would allow. The Edie family followed the suggested route, beginning with the Greek and Roman collections. Dorothy dutifully looked at the marble statues, the pottery, the architectural fragments. She was polite and attentive, but Caroline could tell her daughter wasn't truly engaged. She was going through the motions, waiting for something. They moved through several more galleries, Renaissance paintings, medieval manuscripts, Assyrian reliefs. Dorothy remained polite but distant, her eyes scanning each room as they entered, then losing interest when she didn't find whatever she was looking for. And then they reached the Egyptian wing. The moment Dorothy stepped through the doorway into the Hall of Egyptian Artifacts, everything changed. The transformation was so sudden and so complete that Caroline actually gasped. Dorothy froze in mid-step, her entire body going rigid. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell open, and she made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Around her, the world of ancient Egypt unfolded in all its reconstructed glory. Massive statues of pharaohs stood like sentinels, their stone faces serene and eternal. Carved pillars covered in hieroglyphs reached toward the ceiling, recreating the columns that had once held up temple roofs. Stone reliefs depicted scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, and mythological events, the carved figures frozen in eternal motion. The lighting in the room was different from the other galleries, dimmer and more atmospheric, designed to evoke the shadowy interiors of tombs and temples. The air even smelled different, whether through actual atmospheric control or simply the power of suggestion. Visitors often reported sensing something ancient, something other in that space. For Dorothy, it was overwhelming. Tears began streaming down her face, silent at first, then accompanied by sounds of genuine grief. She pulled her hands free from her parents' grip and took several steps forward, her whole body trembling. Caroline reached for her daughter, frightened by the intensity of her reaction, but Dorothy moved out of reach, walking deeper into the room with a strange certainty, as if she knew exactly where she was going, even though she had never been there before in this life. She stopped in front of a display case containing a limestone statue of a woman. The figure was perhaps 2 feet tall, carved with the characteristic Egyptian style. Formal pose, idealized features, hands positioned in ritual gesture. The woman wore the robes of a priestess, her linen garment carved with careful attention to the drape and fold of fabric. Her hands were raised, palms outward, in a position of offering or blessing. Her face was serene, eyes gazing forward, into eternity, lips curved in the subtle smile that Egyptian artists gave to the blessed dead. Dorothy pressed both hands against the glass of the display case, her face inches from the statue, her breath fogging the surface. She was crying openly now, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for her small frame. "That's me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's me!" Caroline and Reuben exchanged horrified glances. Other visitors were beginning to stare, moving away from the obviously distressed child and her embarrassed parents. A museum guard began walking toward them, concerned by the scene. Caroline knelt beside her daughter, trying to speak calmly despite her own rising panic. "Sweetheart, that's just a statue. It's very old, from a time long before any of us were born. It's not you. It can't be you." But Dorothy shook her head violently, refusing to look away from the figure in the case. "I remember," she said. "I remember being there. I remember wearing those clothes. I remember standing like that, making offerings, praying. I remember all of it." Reuben tried to pull Dorothy away from the display, but she clung to the case, her fingers leaving smudges on the glass. She was becoming hysterical now, her sobs turning into wails. Other visitors were staring openly, some with pity, others with disapproval. The guard reached them and asked politely but firmly if there was a problem, if the child was unwell, if perhaps they needed to step outside. It took both parents working together to pry Dorothy away from the statue. She fought them, reaching back toward the display case, crying out words they couldn't understand. They half carried, half dragged her out of the Egyptian wing, through the corridors, out of the museum entirely. Outside on the steps, Dorothy finally collapsed against her mother, exhausted from the intensity of her emotion. The journey home was silent. Dorothy sat between her parents on the train, staring at nothing, tears still streaming down her face. Caroline held her daughter close, frightened and confused, having no framework to understand what had just happened. Reuben stared out the window, his jaw clenched, determined to never mention this embarrassing episode again. But Dorothy would never stop mentioning it, because what had happened in that museum wasn't a breakdown or a tantrum. It was recognition, a homecoming, a moment when the memories she had been carrying found external validation, when the internal world she had been trying to describe finally had a name. Egypt. That was the place she had been trying to remember. That was home. From that day forward, Dorothy's life had a focus, a direction, a purpose. She would spend the rest of her childhood, her adolescence, her entire adult life trying to return to the place she had seen in that museum, the place that felt more real to her than the London suburb where her body had been born. She would dedicate herself to learning everything she could about ancient Egypt, absorbing information with an intensity that went far beyond academic interest. She would study maps, memorize geographic features, learn the names of gods and pharaohs and priests. She would teach herself hieroglyphs, practice pronunciation, immerse herself in a culture that had been dead for thousands of years but that felt, to her, more alive than the world around her. And she would begin to remember, not just vague impressions or emotional responses, but specific details, names, faces, events, the architecture of temples, the rhythm of daily rituals, the texture of linen robes, and the taste of temple bread. She would remember a life that, according to every rule of logic and reason, she could not possibly remember. But she did remember, and those memories would shape everything that came after. Chapter 3. Knowledge without education. The years between Dorothy's visit to the British Museum and her adolescence were marked by an increasingly unusual education. While other girls her age were learning domestic skills and preparing for futures as wives and mothers, Dorothy was teaching herself ancient Egyptian language, history and culture, with an obsessive focus that alarmed her parents and confused her teachers. The resources available to her were limited. This was the early 20th century, before the internet, before public libraries were well stocked with specialised materials, before information was easily accessible to ordinary people. Dorothy had to work with whatever she could find. Outdated encyclopedias, borrowed books, occasional magazines that featured articles on archaeological discoveries. But she absorbed everything she encountered with astonishing speed and retention. She read books about Egyptian history once, and could recall specific details months later. She studied maps of the Nile River Valley and could draw them from memory, including landmarks and geographic features that most British children had never heard of. She learned hieroglyphs by copying them repeatedly until she could recognise and reproduce hundreds of symbols. What made this self-education remarkable wasn't just its intensity, but its nature. Dorothy didn't study Egypt the way a scholar would, with detachment and analytical distance. She studied it the way someone studies their hometown after years of exile, with recognition and longing. She didn't learn facts, she remembered them. By the time she was 14 years old, Dorothy's knowledge of ancient Egypt had grown beyond what casual self-education could explain. She could describe temple architecture with a level of detail that suggested first-hand familiarity. She knew the proper orientation of sacred buildings, the symbolic significance of their design elements, the hierarchical organisation of their interior spaces. She spoke of religious ceremonies with an intimacy that went beyond textbook descriptions. She knew which prayers were said at which hours of the day. She knew the specific offerings made to specific gods during specific festivals. She knew the proper methods for preparing incense, the types of flowers used in religious garlands, the protocols for handling sacred objects. Some of this knowledge could theoretically have been gleaned from books, though it would have required access to specialised academic texts that were not available to a working-class teenage girl in London. But much of what Dorothy knew was not in any books at all, at least not in the early 20th century. She described underground chambers beneath certain temples, spaces used for storage and preparation that had not yet been excavated. She mentioned architectural features that would not be discovered until decades later. She spoke of daily rituals and practices that were not documented in the limited scholarly literature of her time. When she was 16, Dorothy encountered her first professional Egyptologist. The meeting happened by chance at a public lecture series on ancient civilizations. The speaker was a respected academic who had participated in excavations in Egypt. During the question period after his presentation, Dorothy raised her hand and asked a question about the water management systems at the Temple of Seti I in Abydos. The Egyptologist was surprised that a young woman would ask such a specific question. He answered politely, providing what information he could based on the limited excavations that had been conducted at the site. Dorothy listened, then respectfully disagreed with one of his points. She explained in detail how she believed the water channels had actually been arranged, describing their purpose and function. The Egyptologist was taken aback. After the lecture, he sought Dorothy out and asked where she had learned about these systems. Dorothy hesitated, then told him she had read about them. The Egyptologist frowned, explaining that very little had been published on this particular aspect of temple architecture. The excavations at Abydos were still ongoing, and many features had not yet been fully documented. Dorothy simply smiled and said she must have read more broadly than he realised. The encounter left the Egyptologist puzzled but intrigued. He gave Dorothy his card and told her to contact him if she ever wanted to discuss ancient Egypt further. Dorothy never did. She was learning to be careful about displaying her knowledge too openly. People either dismissed her as an eccentric girl with an overactive imagination, or they became uncomfortable with the precision of what she knew. But the knowledge kept coming. As Dorothy entered her late teens and early 20s, the memories became more specific, more personal, more impossible to explain through conventional means. She began to remember not just public spaces and religious ceremonies, but private moments. The smell of oil lamps burning in evening darkness, the sound of reed mats rustling underfoot, the sensation of linen fabric against skin in oppressive heat, the taste of dates and beer, the common sustenance of temple workers. She remembered faces, not the idealized formal images carved in stone, but real human faces with individual features and expressions. She remembered voices, conversations, jokes shared among temple workers during long hours of repetitive labour. She remembered the hierarchy of relationships, who deferred to whom, which priests were kind and which were harsh, who could be trusted and who needed to be avoided. And she began to remember herself, not as Dorothy Eady, the displaced English girl longing for a homeland she had never seen, but as someone else. Someone who had lived in those temples, performed those rituals, walked those stone corridors when they were new and vital rather than ruined and dead. She remembered a name, Bentrashit. It meant harp of joy in ancient Egyptian. She remembered being called by that name, responding to it, identifying with it more completely than she had ever identified with Dorothy. She remembered her role, a priestess dedicated to the worship of Osiris, god of death and resurrection, ruler of the underworld, judge of souls. She remembered taking vows of chastity and service, committing herself to a life of ritual purity and spiritual devotion. And she remembered breaking those vows in a way that had cost her everything. By the time Dorothy was in her mid-20s, she had assembled a detailed narrative of what she believed was her past life. The story was consistent, emotionally coherent, and filled with specific details that would take decades to verify. She told this story to very few people, and when she did, she was careful to frame it as something she believed, not something she could prove. But privately she had no doubt. She wasn't learning about ancient Egypt, she was remembering it. And the memories were growing stronger with each passing year, building toward an inevitable conclusion. She would have to return to Egypt in this life, to the place where her previous life had ended, to see with these new eyes the home she had never truly left. The question was not whether she would go. The question was when and how, and what she would find when she finally stood again in the temples she had never forgotten. Chapter 4. The past life identity emerges. The identity of Bentrashit did not arrive all at once in Dorothy's consciousness. It emerged gradually, piece by piece, like a mosaic being slowly revealed as centuries of dust are carefully brushed away. Each memory brought new details, new emotions, new certainty that she had lived before and that her current existence was merely a continuation of something that had begun long ago. By her late 20s, Dorothy could recount the story of Bentrashit's life with the kind of detailed consistency that usually only comes from lived experience. She spoke of this past life not as a fantasy or a historical reconstruction, but as autobiography. The memories had the texture of reality, sensory, emotional, specific in ways that imagination rarely achieves. She remembered being born to a common family in a small village near Abydos during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, in what modern chronology would place as the 13th century before the Common Era. Her father had been a soldier, her mother a woman who worked as a weaver. They had been neither wealthy nor destitute, existing in that middle space where survival required constant effort but was usually achievable. Bentrashit had been their only child to survive infancy, and they had raised her with a mixture of love and practicality typical of working families throughout history. When she was still a small child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, her parents had made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. They would dedicate her to the temple. This was not an unusual practice. Families of modest means often placed their children in temple service as a way of ensuring they would be fed, housed, and educated. In return, the child would serve the gods through the performance of daily rituals, and the family would gain spiritual merit and social standing. Bentrashit remembered the day she had entered the temple for the first time as a formal initiate. She remembered walking through the massive pylon gateway, the towering walls on either side carved with images of gods and pharaohs. She remembered the sudden shift from bright sunlight to the cool shadow of the interior courtyard. She remembered the smell, incense of course, but also stone dust, oil from the lamps, the faint sweetness of flower offerings left before statues. She remembered being frightened. The temple was vast, overwhelming to a child. The priests and priestesses moved with serious purpose, their white linen robes flowing as they performed tasks she didn't yet understand. The gods stared down from the walls, their from painted eyes seeming to follow her as she was led deeper into the sacred space. But she also remembered feeling something else, a sense of rightness, of belonging, as though she had finally arrived at the place where she was meant to be. The training of a temple priestess was rigorous and comprehensive. Bentrashit remembered years of instruction in ritual procedures, religious texts, and the practical skills necessary for maintaining a sacred space. She learned how to prepare offerings, the correct arrangement of bread, beer, meat, and vegetables before divine statues. She learned purification rituals, the proper way to bathe, the prayers to recite, the mental discipline required to maintain ritual purity. She learned to read and write hieroglyphs, an unusual skill for a woman of common birth but necessary for her temple duties. She learned sacred songs and chants, memorizing lengthy texts that would be recited during ceremonies. She learned the calendar of festivals, the names and attributes of gods, the mythology and theology that underpinned Egyptian religious practice. And she learned silence. The temple valued quiet contemplation, meditative states in which the divine could be heard. Bentrashit remembered long hours spent in silent prayer, her mind focused on the mysteries of death and resurrection that were Osiris's domain. As she matured from child to adolescent to young woman, Bentrashit took on more responsibilities. She was entrusted with maintaining specific shrines, ensuring that offerings were fresh, that lamps were lit, that sacred spaces remained clean and orderly. She participated in processions during major festivals, carrying sacred objects through the temple grounds while crowds of worshippers looked on. Her life was structured, predictable, and deeply meaningful. She had found purpose in service to the divine. She had found community among her fellow priests and priestesses. She had found a sense of peace that had eluded her during her chaotic childhood. And then she met the pharaoh. Dorothy spoke of this meeting with an intensity that was difficult to witness, even decades after claiming these memories. Even in her 70s, when she recounted the story for researchers, her voice would change when she described seeing Pharaoh Seti I for the first time. The emotion was raw, immediate, painfully real. She remembered it was during a festival, one of the major religious celebrations that drew crowds from across the region. The pharaoh had travelled to Abydos to make offerings at the temple, to participate in ceremonies that reinforced his role as the mediator between gods and humanity. Bentrashit had been among the priestesses selected to assist with the ceremonies. She remembered standing in the inner courtyard as the royal procession entered. She remembered the sound of trumpets, the rhythmic chanting, the rustle of linen robes as hundreds of people moved in coordinated ritual motion. And she remembered the moment when Pharaoh Seti had looked directly at her. Historical records describe Seti I as a powerful military commander who had restored Egyptian power after a period of weakness. He was a builder, a warrior, a man who took his religious duties seriously. In formal portraits he appears stern, authoritative, every inch the divine king. But Dorothy remembered him differently. She remembered a man burdened by impossible responsibilities, isolated by his position, hungry for genuine human connection. She remembered eyes that were tired despite their intensity, a bearing that was regal but not cold. She remembered that their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Interest. A spark that neither had been seeking but both instantly felt. What followed, according to Dorothy's memories, was a forbidden relationship that unfolded over several years. It was conducted in absolute secrecy, in the gardens at night, in quiet, corners of the vast temple complex where they could speak without being observed. Seti would visit the temple frequently, always under the pretext of religious duty, but finding moments to be with Bentrashit away from the eyes of priests and courtiers. Dorothy spoke of these encounters with a tenderness that felt deeply personal. She described conversations about philosophy, about the burden of power, about the nature of the gods and the meaning of life. She said Seti had confided in her about the loneliness of kingship, the way his every action was scrutinized and interpreted, the way he could never simply be human. She said she'd offered him something his position denied him: honesty, genuine affection, a space where he could set aside the weight of the crown and simply exist. And she said she had loved him, not with the passion of youth, but with the depth of true recognition, the sense that she had found the one person in the world who truly understood her. But the relationship was untenable. Priestesses took vows of chastity. Involvement with the pharaoh, even the pharaoh himself, was a profound violation of religious law. If discovered, the consequences would be severe not just for Bentrashit, but potentially for Seti's reign, for the temple's spiritual authority, the delicate balance of religious and political power that held Egyptian society together. They both knew it couldn't continue. They both tried to end it several times, but they kept finding their way back to each other, unable to resist the pull of something that felt larger and more significant than their individual wills. The end, when it came, was devastating. Dorothy remembered being discovered. She never specified exactly how it happened, whether someone saw them together, whether a fellow priestess became suspicious, whether palace officials investigating Seti's movements uncovered the truth. But somehow, the secret was revealed. She remembered being brought before the high priest for questioning. She remembered the accusations, the demands that she confess, the threats of punishment. She remembered understanding with absolute clarity that her life as she had known it was over. She had three choices: confess and face exile and disgrace, deny everything and force the matter to trial, where the pharaoh himself might be implicated, or take a third option that would spare everyone further suffering. Bentrashi chose the third option. Dorothy spoke of her death in her past life with a matter-of-factness that was chilling. She said she had poisoned herself, taking a quick-acting substance that ended her life before the full investigation could proceed. She said she had done it to protect Seti, to prevent the scandal from damaging his reign, and to spare herself the humiliation of public punishment. She said her last thoughts had been of the temple, of the life of service and meaning she was leaving behind, and of the man she had loved who would now have to carry on without her. And then she had died. The memories ended. The life of Bentrashi concluded in a moment of darkness that Dorothy described as both terrifying and strangely peaceful, a letting go that had also been a promise that somehow, someday, she would return. When Dorothy recounted this narrative, she did so without drama or embellishment. She spoke plainly, as someone might describe any important event from their past. She acknowledged that she had no proof, that she was asking people to believe something extraordinary based solely on her word and the consistency of her memories. But she never wavered in her certainty. Bentrashi was not a fantasy or a psychological construct. Bentrashi was real. Bentrashi was her. And what had happened in that past life was the reason she felt so displaced in this one, so convinced that her true home was somewhere 3,000 years and thousands of miles away. The question, for those who encountered Dorothy's story, was whether to believe her. And that question would become more complicated as the years passed, and Dorothy finally made the journey to Egypt, where her memories would face their ultimate test against the physical reality of ancient ruins and modern archaeological discoveries. Chapter 5. Returning to Egypt. The journey from London to Egypt in the early 1950s was not a simple matter. International travel was expensive, logistically complex, and still carried an air of adventure rather than routine. For Dorothy, now in her late 40s, the move represented the culmination of 4 decades of longing and the final acknowledgement that she could not live out her life in England, thousands of miles from the place her soul insisted was home. She'd worked for years to save the money necessary for travel and relocation. She had taken various jobs, as a teacher, as a clerk, as a nanny to wealthy families who found her eccentricities charming rather than disturbing. She had lived frugally, spending almost nothing on herself, funneling every spare penny toward the goal of returning to Egypt. In 1952, she finally had enough. She quit her job, sold what few possessions she'd accumulated, said goodbye to parents who by now were resigned to their daughter's strange destiny, and boarded a ship bound for Alexandria. The journey took weeks. Dorothy spent most of it on deck, staring south toward the approaching African coast, feeling something inside her shift and settle as the distance closed. She later described the voyage as a gradual awakening, as though with each mile travelled, a piece of herself that had been dormant was coming back to life. When the ship finally docked in Alexandria, Dorothy stepped onto Egyptian soil for the first time in this life. She later said that the moment her foot touched the ground, she began to weep. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. She was home. She spent a few weeks in Cairo establishing herself, making contacts within the Department of Antiquities, and finding work. Her knowledge of ancient Egyptian language and culture, combined with her ability to draft and her willingness to work for modest pay, made her a valuable employee. The fact that she was a European woman with unconventional beliefs was noted but not held against her. Egypt in the 1950s was accustomed to eccentric foreigners drawn to its ancient past. Dorothy worked as a draftsperson and researcher, creating detailed drawings of artifacts, cataloguing items, assisting with translations. She was competent and dedicated, quickly earning the respect of her colleagues despite their private amusement at some of her more unusual claims. But Cairo was never meant to be her final destination. It was merely a necessary stop, a place to establish herself professionally and financially, before she could make the journey she'd been planning in her mind for decades. In 1956, Dorothy applied for and received a transfer to the archaeological site at Abydos, located in Upper Egypt, several hundred miles south of Cairo. Abydos was home to one of the most important temple complexes in ancient Egypt, including the Temple of Seti I, the pharaoh Dorothy claimed to have known and loved in her past life. The journey from Cairo to Abydos took most of a day, travelling by train, and then by hired vehicle along dusty roads that followed the course of the Nile. The landscape was stark, the desert pressing close on both sides, the narrow strip of agricultural land clinging to the riverbank, small villages of mud brick houses appearing and disappearing as they travelled. Dorothy sat in the back of the vehicle, silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was 52 years old. Her hair had begun to grey. Her face showed the lines of a life spent longing for something just out of reach. But her eyes, as they approached Abydos, held an intensity that made her seem much younger, almost feverish with anticipation. And then, in the distance, she saw it. The ancient temple complex, the massive stone walls rising from the sand, the structures that had stood for over 3,000 years. Dorothy made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a cry. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, concerned, but she waved him on. She was fine, more than fine. She was home. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the modern village that had grown up near the ruins. Dorothy climbed out, thanked the driver, gathered her few belongings, and stood staring at the temple. Other workers moved about their business, archaeologists and labourers engaged in the ongoing excavation and preservation work. No one paid particular attention to the middle-aged British woman standing motionless in the heat. But Dorothy was not seeing the site as it existed in 1956. She was seeing it as it had been, complete and alive, the walls painted in brilliant colours, the courtyards filled with priests and worshippers, the air thick with incense and chanting. She was seeing memory superimposed on reality, past and present occupying the same space. After a long moment, Dorothy picked up her bag and walked toward the temple. She moved with purpose, her stride confident despite the fact that she had never physically been here before in this life. She entered through the main gate, passed through the first courtyard, turned left down a columned corridor, and found herself in a specific section of the complex. A small chamber that had once, according to temple records, been used for preparation and storage. She stood in the centre of that chamber, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I remember this room." Over the following days and weeks, Dorothy settled into life at Abydos. She found accommodation in the village, a simple room in a house near the temple grounds. She reported to the archaeological team, introduced herself, and began her work, assisting with documentation and preservation. But more significantly, she began to demonstrate something that would perplex and unsettle researchers for the rest of her life, an ability to navigate the temple complex as though she had always known it, as though the layout was not something she needed to learn, but something she simply remembered. She would walk through corridors without hesitation, knowing which turns to take to reach specific locations. She would point out features, a niche in a wall, a damaged inscription, a partially buried chamber, and explain their original purpose with casual confidence. When asked how she knew these things, she would smile and say simply, "I remember." The archaeological team initially dismissed her claims as the harmless eccentricities of a dedicated amateur. But as time passed, and Dorothy's predictions and descriptions proved accurate again and again, that dismissal became more difficult to maintain. She told them there should be a garden, on the western side of the temple, in an area that had not yet been fully excavated. The team was sceptical. No records mentioned such a garden. But when they dug where Dorothy indicated, they found the remains of an ancient garden, irrigation channels, spaces for planting beds, evidence of cultivation. She described underground chambers that would be discovered beneath certain sections of the temple. She explained their purposes: storage for oils and incense, preparation spaces for ritual materials, private meditation chambers for high priests. When excavations eventually revealed these spaces, her descriptions matched the archaeological findings. She spoke of specific statues and their original locations, of inscriptions that had not yet been uncovered, of architectural features that were still buried. Time and again, subsequent excavations proved her right. The most unsettling incidents involved Dorothy's emotional responses to certain locations within the temple. There were places where she would stop, overwhelmed by feeling, and recount memories of events that had supposedly occurred there. She would describe ceremonies she claimed to have witnessed, conversations she had overheard, personal moments of prayer or contemplation. And in one specific location, a secluded corner of the temple's garden area, Dorothy became completely overcome. She sat on the ground, weeping uncontrollably, and explained that this was where she and Pharaoh Seti had met in secret. This was where they had talked, where they had shared the dangerous intimacy that would ultimately cost Bentrashi her life. The archaeologists didn't know what to make of Dorothy Eady. Some thought she was a skilled researcher who had memorized architectural patterns and was making educated guesses that occasionally proved correct. Others thought she was suffering from a psychological condition that had created an elaborate false memory system. A few, more open-minded or more unsettled by what they witnessed, began to wonder if perhaps she was telling the truth, if perhaps consciousness really could carry memories across lifetimes. But regardless of what they thought, they couldn't deny that Dorothy was useful. Her insights, whatever their source, helped guide excavations. Her knowledge of temple protocols and religious practices informed their interpretations of artifacts and inscriptions. Her dedication to the site was absolute. She worked long hours, asked for little compensation, and treated the ancient stones with a reverence that went beyond academic interest. Dorothy had come home, and having arrived, she would never leave again. Chapter 6. Working with Archaeologists. Dorothy Eady's years at Abydos were marked by an unusual dual existence. On one level, she was simply an employee of the Department of Antiquities, performing routine tasks of documentation, preservation, and site maintenance. On another level, she was something unprecedented, a bridge between ancient and modern, a woman who claimed to remember the temple not as ruins to be studied, but as living spaces she had once inhabited. The professional Egyptologists who worked alongside Dorothy found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The academic discipline prided itself on rigorous methodology, empirical evidence, and skeptical analysis. Claims of reincarnation and past life memory were not part of the scholarly toolkit. Yet here was a woman whose insights were proving valuable, whose knowledge seemed to exceed what conventional study could explain, and whose sincerity was difficult to dismiss. One of the first archaeologists to work closely with Dorothy was a researcher named Abdel Salam Hussein, who was leading excavations at the Temple of Seti I during the late 1950s. Hussein was trained in modern archaeological methods, committed to scientific rigour, and initially sceptical of Dorothy's claims. But he was also pragmatic. If Dorothy could help them understand the site better, he was willing to work with her regardless of how unusual her methods might be. Hussein began consulting Dorothy before excavations, asking her to examine areas and provide her impressions of what might be found there. He framed these consultations carefully, treating them as hypotheses to be tested rather than revelations to be accepted uncritically. This approach allowed him to utilize Dorothy's insights while maintaining his scientific credibility. The results were remarkable enough that Hussein kept detailed notes, though he rarely published them during his lifetime. In his private journals, he documented numerous instances where Dorothy's descriptions proved accurate. She would examine an area, explain what she believed had been there originally, and then excavations would uncover evidence supporting her claims. In one case, Dorothy told Hussein that there had been a series of small shrines along the eastern wall of an outer courtyard. She described them in detail, their approximate size, their purpose as secondary offering spaces for pilgrims of lower status who were not permitted into the main temple, even the types of votive objects that would have been left there. Hussein marked the area and organised an excavation. They found the foundations of small structures precisely where Dorothy had indicated. The spacing, size and orientation matched her description, and when they sifted through the archaeological layers, they found remains of the types of offerings Dorothy had mentioned. Small ceramic figures, simple food offerings preserved in the dry climate, inscribed stones with prayers to Osiris. In another instance, Dorothy explained that there should be evidence of a sacred pool used for purification rituals in a specific location. The surface showed no indication of such a structure, but when they excavated they found the remains of a limestone-lined pool, complete with steps for descending into the water and channels for filling and draining. These successes accumulated over the years. Dorothy would make a claim, excavations would proceed, and more often than not her descriptions would be validated. The ratio of accuracy was far higher than chance or educated guessing would predict. But it wasn't just large architectural features. Dorothy also provided insights into smaller details that proved equally accurate. She described the specific pigments used in painted reliefs, explaining which colours had been applied in which sequence. Chemical analysis of paint residues confirmed her descriptions. She explained the significance of particular hieroglyphic inscriptions, providing context that helped researchers understand their meaning and purpose. She identified damaged or worn carvings, explaining what the complete images had originally depicted. One of the most striking examples of Dorothy's knowledge involved a series of underground chambers that had been identified through ground-penetrating surveys, but not yet excavated. The chambers appeared to extend beneath the main temple, in a complex pattern that puzzled researchers. Dorothy studied the survey results, and then drew a detailed map showing how the chambers connected, their relative sizes, and their probable purposes. When excavations finally revealed the chambers, Dorothy's map proved remarkably accurate. She had correctly identified which spaces were storage areas, which were preparation rooms, and which were likely meditation chambers. She had even correctly predicted the location of connecting passages that hadn't shown up clearly on the surveys. The researchers asked Dorothy how she'd known. She explained, calmly and without hesitation, that she remembered these spaces. She had worked in them. She had carried offerings through those passages, prepared sacred materials in those rooms, meditated in those chambers. She remembered the smell of oil lamps, the coolness of the underground air, the echo of footsteps on stone floors. Not all of Dorothy's insights proved correct. There were times when excavations didn't reveal what she predicted, when her descriptions didn't match what was found. But the success rate was high enough that researchers couldn't simply dismiss her as a lucky guesser. Something was happening that didn't fit comfortable explanations. Dorothy's daily routine at Abydos became well known among the archaeological community. She would arrive at the temple site early each morning, often before dawn, and spend time alone walking through the ruins. She said these early hours, when the air was still cool and the site was quiet, were when her memories were clearest. She would touch the stone walls, sit in particular locations, and allow herself to remember. After these private hours, she would begin her official work, drawing artifacts, cataloguing finds, assisting with translations, maintaining records. She was meticulous and professional in these tasks, treating them with the same seriousness she brought to everything related to the temple. But in the evenings, after the official workday ended and other personnel had left the site, Dorothy would return. She would spend hours sitting near the temple, sometimes inside the ruins, sometimes in the surrounding grounds. Colleagues who passed by during these evening vigils reported seeing her talking to herself, or, as Dorothy explained, talking to Seti. She claimed that she could sense his presence in the temple, that on certain nights she could hear his voice, that the connection they had forged in that past life remained unbroken across millennia. She said she felt his approval of her return, his relief that she had found her way back, his continued love persisting beyond death. Most researchers treated these claims as Dorothy's private spiritual experience, not something that required scientific investigation, but some found the intensity of her belief unsettling. She wasn't play-acting or indulging in fantasy. She genuinely experienced these encounters as real, and her conviction was absolute. One researcher, a British Egyptologist who worked at Abydos during the 1960s, later wrote about his impressions of Dorothy. He described her as one of the most knowledgeable non-academic experts on Egyptian temple culture he had ever encountered. He noted that her insights into ritual practices, religious symbolism, and daily temple life were often more nuanced than what could be found in textbooks, and he admitted with careful academic caution that he could not fully explain the source of her knowledge. He also wrote about the emotional atmosphere Dorothy created. When she led tours through the temple, explaining its history and function, visitors often reported feeling moved in ways they couldn't articulate. Dorothy spoke with such intimate familiarity, with such obvious love for the place, that it was impossible not to be affected. She didn't lecture about the temple, she reminisced about it, and that difference was palpable. By the late 1960s, Dorothy had become a fixture at Abydos. She had adopted the name Om-Seti, Mother of Seti, as both a tribute to the pharaoh she claimed to have loved and as a public acknowledgement of her spiritual identity. The local villagers knew her as the British woman who loved the old temple, who could sometimes be heard singing ancient hymns in the evening, who treated the ruins with a devotion that felt more religious than academic. The Department of Antiquities valued her work enough to keep her employed despite her eccentricities. Tourists who visited the site often sought her out, eager to hear her stories. Researchers consulted her when they needed context for their findings. She had carved out a unique role for herself, existing at the boundary between scholarship and spirituality, between past and present, between memory and experience. And through it all she remained absolutely certain she was Bentrashit. She had lived in this temple 3,000 years ago. She had loved Pharaoh Seti. She had died here and been reborn elsewhere. And now, having found her way back, she would never leave again. The question that haunted those who knew her was simple but profound. Was she right? Chapter 7. The Conspiracy Interpretation. For those who approach Dorothy Eady's story through the lens of alternative history and consciousness research, her case represents something far more significant than an interesting psychological quirk or a curious historical footnote. It represents potential evidence for one of the most profound and controversial claims human beings have ever made, that consciousness survives death and can carry memories across lifetimes. The conspiracy interpretation, and it's important to understand that conspiracy in this context doesn't mean a hidden plot, but rather an alternative framework for understanding reality, begins with a simple premise. What if Dorothy was telling the truth? What if she genuinely did remember a previous life? What if her knowledge came not from books or subconscious learning, but from actual experience in another time? What if the fall that nearly killed her at age 3 somehow opened a doorway between this life and a past one, allowing memories to flow through in a way that's rare but not impossible? This interpretation challenges several fundamental assumptions of modern Western thought. It challenges the materialist model of consciousness, which holds that awareness is produced by brain activity and therefore must end when the brain dies. It challenges religious frameworks that teach singular lives followed by eternal afterlife. It challenges our understanding of identity, time, and the nature of existence itself. But proponents of this interpretation argue that these challenges are precisely why Dorothy's case has been softened, reframed, and marginalised rather than seriously investigated by mainstream institutions. They suggest that acknowledging genuine reincarnation would be too disruptive to too many powerful frameworks of belief and understanding. Let's examine the evidence they point to. First, the consistency and longevity of Dorothy's claims. From the age of 3 until her death at 77, Dorothy maintained the same essential narrative. The details she provided about her life as Bentrashi never changed. She never contradicted herself, never revised the story, never admitted uncertainty about the core elements of her claimed past life identity. This consistency is unusual in cases of false memory or fantasy. People who construct elaborate fictional identities typically show inconsistencies over time. They add details, alter circumstances, contradict earlier statements. The human memory is plastic and unreliable, prone to distortion and confabulation. But Dorothy's memories showed remarkable stability across 7 decades. Second, the accuracy of her knowledge. Dorothy described architectural features, ritual practices, and historical details that were later confirmed by archaeological evidence. Some of this information was not available in published sources at the time she first mentioned it. Some of it contradicted accepted scholarly understanding until new discoveries proved Dorothy correct. Skeptics argue that Dorothy could have absorbed information subconsciously and reconstructed it in ways that seemed like genuine memory. But this explanation struggles to account for the specificity of what Dorothy knew. She didn't just recall general facts. She provided precise details about locations, purposes, and practices that were verified decades later through excavation and analysis. Third, the emotional authenticity of Dorothy's experience. Those who knew her consistently reported that her attachment to Egypt and to the temple at Abydos was not performative or attention-seeking. It was deep, genuine, and profoundly felt. Her grief when speaking of Bentrashi's death was real. Her joy when she finally returned to Egypt was overwhelming. Her daily devotions at the temple were sincere expressions of religious and personal commitment. Psychological explanations for Dorothy's experience, dissociative disorders, trauma responses, elaborate coping mechanisms, all struggle to account for this emotional genuineness combined with the practical accuracy of her knowledge. People experiencing delusions typically show other signs of psychological dysfunction. Dorothy did not. Apart from her reincarnation beliefs, she was stable, competent, socially functional, and capable of maintaining employment and relationships. Fourth, the lack of obvious motive. Dorothy gained little from her claims except difficulty. She lived modestly, worked for minimal pay, endured skepticism and mockery from many quarters. She never wrote a best-selling book, never became wealthy from her story, never leveraged her unusual experience for fame or fortune. If her claims were fabricated, what was the payoff? Why maintain an elaborate performance for 7 decades with no apparent reward? The conspiracy interpretation suggests that Dorothy's case, if accepted at face value, would require a fundamental revision of our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the continuity of existence. And it proposes that mainstream institutions, scientific, religious, and cultural, have strong incentives to avoid such a revision. From a scientific perspective, accepting reincarnation would undermine materialist models of mind that have dominated neuroscience and psychology for over a century. It would require acknowledging that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of brain function, but something more fundamental, something that can exist independently of physical substrate and transfer between bodies. This is not a comfortable position for mainstream science. Modern scientific methodology is built on materialist assumptions that only physical phenomena can be studied empirically, that subjective experience must ultimately be reducible to objective processes, that claims of non-physical reality are inherently suspect. Reincarnation, if real, suggests these assumptions are incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. From a religious perspective, reincarnation poses problems for the dominant Western faiths. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all teach doctrines of singular life followed by judgment and eternal existence in heaven or hell. Reincarnation suggests a very different cosmology, multiple lives, karmic consequences stretching across lifetimes, progressive spiritual development through repeated incarnations. Acknowledging reincarnation would require these faiths to either revise their core teachings or admit they've been incomplete. Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism have always taught reincarnation, but for Western institutions to accept it would represent a profound theological shift. From a cultural and philosophical perspective, reincarnation complicates ideas about personal identity and moral responsibility. If we've lived before and will live again, What does that mean for this current existence? Are we responsible for actions taken in previous lives? Do relationships and connections persist across incarnations? How do we understand concepts like justice, punishment, and redemption if they might extend across multiple lifetimes? These are deeply unsettling questions without easy answers, and the conspiracy interpretation suggests that rather than grapple with these questions, mainstream institutions have chosen to frame cases like Dorothy's in ways that avoid their implications. Instead of investigating Dorothy as potential evidence of reincarnation, she's presented as a fascinating psychological curiosity. Her knowledge is attributed to exceptional memory and research skills rather than genuine past life recall. Her emotional conviction is explained as the result of childhood trauma creating an elaborate coping mechanism. Her accurate predictions are downplayed as coincidence or educated guessing. This framing allows people to be intrigued by Dorothy's story without having to take it seriously. It turns her from a potential paradigm shifter into an interesting anecdote, from evidence that challenges fundamental beliefs into a curiosity that reinforces existing skepticism about extraordinary claims. The conspiracy interpretation argues that this softening is not accidental but structural. Institutions that derive their authority from specific frameworks of understanding, scientific materialism, religious doctrine, cultural assumptions about the nature of reality, have strong incentives to resist evidence that undermines those frameworks. Not through active suppression or coordinated censorship, but through the more subtle process of framing, contextualization, and controlled interpretation. Dorothy's case is acknowledged but not investigated rigorously. It's discussed but always with caveats and skeptical distance. It's presented in ways that emphasize the unusual and eccentric aspects rather than the evidential elements. The result is that most people who encounter Dorothy's story come away thinking, that's interesting, rather than that's important. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the real conspiracy, if we want to call it that, is not a group of people actively suppressing truth, but a system of institutional thinking that automatically filters out evidence that doesn't fit acceptable paradigms, that reframes uncomfortable findings in comfortable ways, that maintains existing models of understanding by refusing to take seriously anything that challenges them too fundamentally. Dorothy Eady lived and died believing she'd been Bentrashit, that she had loved a pharaoh, that consciousness survives death, and that memory can persist across lifetimes. If she was correct, it would change everything we think we know about who and what we are. And if mainstream institutions have chosen not to seriously investigate whether she was correct, we might ask ourselves, what are they afraid of finding? Chapter 8. Why the case was softened. To understand why Dorothy Eady's case has been presented as curiosity rather than investigated as potential evidence of something profound, we need to examine the institutional incentives that shape how extraordinary claims are handled in modern society. Start with academia. Universities, research institutions, and scholarly disciplines operate within paradigms, shared frameworks of assumptions, methodologies, and acceptable conclusions. These paradigms are not arbitrary. They're built on centuries of accumulated knowledge and refined understanding. But they're also conservative by nature, resistant to changes that would require fundamental revision of established models. Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions describes how paradigms shift only when anomalies accumulate to the point where the existing framework can no longer accommodate them. Individual anomalies, no matter how well documented, are typically explained away or ignored rather than treated as paradigm-threatening evidence. Dorothy Eady represents an anomaly. Her knowledge, her consistency, her emotional authenticity, and the verification of her claims through archaeological discoveries all suggest something unusual is happening. But she's a single case, easily isolated, and investigating her seriously would require academics to engage with concepts, reincarnation, survival of consciousness, non-physical information transfer, that don't fit within materialist scientific paradigms. The professional cost of investigating Dorothy seriously would be high. Researchers who suggest taking reincarnation claim seriously risk being labelled as credulous, unscientific, or professionally unreliable. Their work becomes harder to publish. In mainstream journals, their grant applications face additional scepticism. Their career advancement is jeopardised. This creates a selection effect. Serious researchers who value their careers avoid topics that carry professional risk. The study of reincarnation claims, consciousness survival, and related phenomena is relegated to the margins of academia, conducted by retired professors who no longer need to worry about career consequences, independent researchers without institutional affiliations, or scientists willing to accept professional marginalisation in exchange for studying what genuinely interests them. The result is that cases like Dorothy's don't receive the rigorous, well-funded investigation they would need to definitively determine what's happening. Instead, they're examined superficially, explained through conventional psychological frameworks, and filed away as interesting but not conclusive. Consider how different institutions approach Dorothy. The Department of Antiquities in Egypt valued her practical contributions but didn't investigate the source of her knowledge systematically. Archaeological teams used her insights when they proved helpful, but didn't design rigorous tests to determine whether she had genuine past life memories. Psychologists who encountered her generally assumed she had a dissociative disorder or elaborate fantasy life, rather than considering that her claims might be accurate. This pattern of superficial engagement while avoiding deep investigation is characteristic of how mainstream institutions handle evidence that doesn't fit comfortable paradigms. It's not active suppression. No one prevented Dorothy from telling her story. No one forcibly stopped research into her claims. It's passive neglect combined with explanatory frameworks that neutralise the challenging implications. Religious institutions face similar incentives. For Western religious authorities, acknowledging reincarnation would require either revising core theological doctrines or admitting those doctrines are incomplete. Both options carry institutional costs. If reincarnation is real, it suggests that religious frameworks based on singular lives followed by eternal judgment are fundamentally mistaken about the nature of existence. This undermines the authority of religious texts, institutions and leaders who have taught these doctrines for millennia. It raises questions about the validity of other religious teachings. It opens the door to theological uncertainty that institutions built on claims of absolute truth find extremely uncomfortable. Rather than engage with this possibility, religious institutions have generally chosen to ignore or dismiss reincarnation evidence. When they do address it, they typically frame it as either demonic deception or psychological delusion, explanations that allow them to acknowledge the phenomenon while denying its challenging implications. Dorothy herself encountered this response from religious authorities. When she lived in England, church leaders told her parents that her claims were evidence of spiritual corruption. They never seriously considered that she might be accurately remembering a previous life. Their framework didn't allow for that possibility, so they defaulted to explanations that fit within Christian doctrine. Cultural institutions face similar issues. Modern Western culture is built on particular assumptions about identity, responsibility, and the nature of self. We assume that identity is continuous within a single lifetime but ends at death. We assume that responsibility is individual and limited to this current existence. We assume that relationships, achievements, and experiences are bounded by our birth and death dates. Reincarnation challenges all of these assumptions. If we've lived before and will live again, identity becomes more complex and continuous. Responsibility might extend across lifetimes. Relationships might reconnect in multiple incarnations. The entire framework of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world shifts dramatically. These shifts are unsettling. They complicate moral philosophy, legal frameworks, and cultural narratives. They raise questions that don't have easy answers, and human institutions, like human beings, tend to avoid questions that threaten comfortable certainties. So Dorothy's case gets softened. It gets presented in ways that make it interesting without being threatening. Media coverage focuses on the human interest angle, the eccentric British woman who believed she was an ancient Egyptian priestess, rather than on the evidential questions of whether her claims are accurate and what that might mean. Documentaries about Dorothy treat her sympathetically, but always with implicit skepticism. Researchers who write about her case frame it carefully, emphasizing psychological explanations and maintaining professional distance from the reincarnation hypothesis. Even, sympathetic treatments tend to hedge, presenting Dorothy as possibly sincere but probably mistaken, as emotionally compelling but not evidentially convincing. This softening serves multiple functions. It allows people to engage with Dorothy's story without having to grapple with its implications. It maintains the authority of existing paradigms by treating anomalous cases as exceptions rather than as evidence requiring paradigm revision, and it signals to others who might have similar experiences that they're unlikely to be taken seriously, which discourages them from coming forward with their own claims. The result is a cultural dynamic where reincarnation remains a fringe belief, taken seriously only by spiritual seekers and alternative researchers, while mainstream institutions dismiss it as either impossible or unproven. Individual cases like Dorothy's are acknowledged but contained, their potential significance neutralized through careful framing and selective emphasis. This containment isn't necessarily conscious or coordinated. It doesn't require a conspiracy in the traditional sense of a group of people actively working to suppress truth. Instead, it emerges naturally from institutional incentives, professional self-interest, and the human tendency to reject information that challenges comfortable worldviews. Mainstream scientists don't investigate reincarnation seriously, because doing so carries professional costs and requires abandoning materialist assumptions that have served them well. Religious authorities don't acknowledge reincarnation because doing so would undermine their theological frameworks and institutional authority. Cultural institutions don't engage deeply with reincarnation evidence because it would complicate narratives about identity, responsibility, and the nature of human existence. And so cases like Dorothy's remain in a curious limbo, acknowledged but not investigated, discussed but not taken seriously, presented as fascinating curiosities rather than as evidence that might require us to revise fundamental assumptions about reality. Dorothy herself seemed aware of this dynamic. In interviews conducted late in her life, she expressed frustration with how her story was being handled. She noted that people were happy to be entertained by her claims, but unwilling to seriously consider their implications. She observed that researchers would use her insights when convenient, but revert to conventional explanations when pressed on the source of her knowledge. She said that the truth was too unsettling for most people to accept, that acknowledging reincarnation would require admitting that much of what we've been taught about the nature of existence is incomplete or wrong, that institutions built on particular models of reality can't easily accommodate evidence that undermines those models. And she was probably right. The softening of her case isn't evidence of active suppression, but of passive resistance, of institutional inertia, of the human tendency to reject uncomfortable truths in favour of comfortable uncertainties. Whether Dorothy was genuinely remembering a past life or experiencing an elaborate psychological phenomenon, her case deserved better investigation than it received. The fact that it didn't get that investigation tells us something important about how we as a society handle evidence that challenges our fundamental beliefs about who and what we are. Chapter 9. The Psychological Question. One of the central questions surrounding Dorothy Eady's case is whether what she experienced can be explained through conventional psychological frameworks, or whether it represents something that existing psychology cannot fully account for. Let's start with the mainstream psychological explanations, because they're substantial and deserve serious consideration. The most common psychological interpretation of Dorothy's case is that she experienced a dissociative disorder, specifically dissociative identity disorder or a related condition. Dissociation is a psychological process in which consciousness, memory and identity become disconnected from each other. In severe cases, this can result in the development of alternate identities or personality states that feel distinct from the person's primary sense of self. The dissociative explanation for Dorothy suggests that her childhood fall and near-death experience at age 3 created severe psychological trauma. Unable to process this trauma through normal developmental mechanisms, her young mind created an alternate identity, Bentrashit, as a psychological refuge. This alternate identity was elaborated over years, becoming increasingly detailed and consistent as Dorothy's cognitive abilities developed. According to this framework, Dorothy's knowledge of ancient Egypt came not from past life memories, but from intensive study that her conscious mind didn't fully acknowledge. She read everything available about Egyptian history and culture, absorbed information from museum visits and conversations, and unconsciously synthesized this material into a coherent narrative that felt like memory rather than learned knowledge. Her emotional investment in the Bentrashi identity served psychological functions. It provided meaning to a life that otherwise felt displaced and purposeless. It offered escape from the disappointments and limitations of her actual existence. It gave her a sense of specialness and significance that she couldn't derive from being an ordinary British woman in mid-20th century England. This explanation has the advantage of not requiring any revision to materialist models of consciousness. It keeps everything within the realm of known psychological processes, even if the specific configuration in Dorothy's case was unusual. It's the kind of explanation that allows professionals to write about her case without risking their careers or challenging fundamental assumptions. But does it actually fit the evidence? There are aspects of Dorothy's case that align with dissociative disorders. The sudden personality shift following childhood trauma is characteristic. The elaborate alternate identity that provides psychological refuge is consistent with how dissociation works. The mixing of fantasy and reality in ways the person experiences as absolutely real is well documented in dissociative conditions. However, there are also aspects that don't fit cleanly. People with dissociative identity disorder typically show significant functional impairment. They struggle to maintain consistent employment, stable relationships, and coherent life narratives. They experience confusion about their identity, time loss during dissociative episodes, and distress from the fragmentation of their sense of self. Dorothy showed none of these markers. She maintained steady employment for decades. She formed and maintained relationships with family, colleagues, and friends. She had a coherent life narrative that integrated both her Dorothy identity and her claimed mentorship memories. She never expressed confusion about her identity. She knew exactly who she was and who she had been. She didn't experience time loss or dissociative episodes that disrupted her daily functioning. Her only symptom was the belief that she had lived before. Everything else about her psychological functioning was normal or above normal. She was intelligent, articulate, socially competent, emotionally stable, and professionally capable. Another psychological explanation is cryptomnesia, the phenomenon where forgotten memories resurface and are mistaken for new experiences. According to this theory, Dorothy encountered information about ancient Egypt as a child through books, museum visits, overheard conversations, or other sources. This information was encoded in her memory but not consciously recalled. Later, when the memories surfaced, they felt like genuine past life experiences rather than learned information. Cryptomnesia is a real phenomenon. People do sometimes remember information without remembering where they learned it. But cryptomnesia typically involves brief, fragmentary memories, not elaborate, consistent narratives sustained across 7 decades. It doesn't explain the depth and integration of Dorothy's knowledge, or the emotional intensity and personal quality of her claimed memories. Moreover, cryptomnesia doesn't account for the information Dorothy had that wasn't available in published sources at the time she first mentioned it. Unless we propose that she somehow absorbed unpublished archaeological data through psychic means, cryptomnesia can't explain this aspect of her knowledge. A third psychological explanation is confabulation, the unconscious creation of false memories to fill gaps in recollection. The brain is remarkably good at constructing plausible narratives from fragmentary information, and people often confidently remember events that never actually occurred in the way they recall. But confabulation, like cryptomnesia, typically produces brief, unstable, false memories that change over time as new information is integrated. Dorothy's memories remained stable and consistent for 7 decades. They didn't evolve or shift in response to new information. They didn't show the malleability characteristic of confabulated memories. There's also the question of motivation. Why would Dorothy's mind create this particular false memory system? What psychological need did it serve that couldn't be met through more conventional fantasies or coping mechanisms? Some psychologists have suggested that Dorothy's reincarnation belief served as a sophisticated form of escapism, allowing her to psychologically reject the disappointments and limitations of her actual life by identifying with an imagined past that was more interesting and meaningful. But this explanation struggles to account for why Dorothy didn't create a more obviously wish-fulfilling fantasy. Ben Trichet's life ended in tragedy. Her relationship with Seti was forbidden and painful. Her death was lonely and driven by shame. If Dorothy was creating an escapist fantasy, why would she create one that involved suffering, loss, and tragic death? Why not imagine a past life of triumph and happiness? The fact that her claimed memories included genuinely painful elements suggests they weren't primarily motivated by wish fulfillment. There's also the problem of explanatory sufficiency. Yes, we can point to psychological processes that might explain individual aspects of Dorothy's experience. Dissociation might explain the alternate identity. Cryptomnesia might explain some of the knowledge. Confabulation might explain the narrative consistency. Escapism might explain the emotional investment. But stringing together a series of rare psychological phenomena to explain a single case starts to look like special pleading. At what point does the psychological explanation become more elaborate and implausible than the reincarnation hypothesis it's meant to replace? This is particularly true when we consider Dorothy's accuracy. She described architectural features before they were discovered. She explained ritual practices that were later confirmed through research. She predicted the location of archaeological remains that were subsequently uncovered. How do we explain this accuracy through psychological processes alone? Are we to believe that Dorothy unconsciously memorized vast amounts of specialized information, synthesized it in ways that produced novel insights, and presented it as past life memory without ever becoming aware of the real source of her knowledge? That's not impossible, but it requires attributing to Dorothy's subconscious mind capabilities that would themselves be extraordinary and worthy of serious research. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that current psychological frameworks don't fully explain Dorothy's case. We can identify processes that might account for some aspects of her experience, but there's a residue of unexplained elements that don't fit neatly into conventional models. This doesn't automatically mean reincarnation is the correct explanation. It means we don't currently have a complete understanding of what was happening with Dorothy. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most important conclusion we can reach. The tendency in cases like this is to rush to explanations that preserve existing paradigms. We want Dorothy to be either genuinely remembering a past life, which would validate spiritual beliefs about consciousness survival, or to be experiencing elaborate psychological processes, which would validate materialist models of mind. We want clean answers that resolve the uncertainty, but sometimes cases don't allow for clean answers. Sometimes the evidence is ambiguous enough that honest investigators have to admit they don't fully understand what's happening. And perhaps Dorothy's case is one of those times. What we can say with confidence is that Dorothy experienced something profound and life-defining that shaped every aspect of her existence from age 3 until her death. Whether that something was genuine past life memory, elaborate psychological construction, or something else entirely remains an open question. And maybe that openness is valuable. Maybe cases like Dorothy's serve an important function by reminding us that consciousness, identity and memory are more complex and mysterious than our current models acknowledge. Maybe the uncertainty is itself the lesson, pushing us to hold our explanations more lightly and remain curious about possibilities we haven't yet fully explored. Dorothy herself would probably be satisfied with that. She never demanded that people believe her. She simply told her truth and lived according to it, leaving others free to interpret her. Experience however they saw fit. The conviction was hers. The interpretation remains ours. Epilogue: The memory that did not fade. Dorothy Eady died on April 21st, 1981, in the small village near Abydos where she had lived for the last 25 years of her life. She was 77 years old. Her health had been declining gradually. her body wearing out in the way bodies do after decades of hard use and simple living. She died in her sleep peacefully in the simple room she had called home since moving to Abydos. Outside her window, visible in the morning light, stood the temple of Seti I, the place she had spent her life claiming as her true home. In her final years, she had told friends that she was ready. She had done what she came to do. She had returned to the place where Bentrashi's life had ended. She had honoured the memory of the pharaoh she claimed to have loved, and she had dedicated the remainder of this life to the service of the temple that had meant everything to her in that previous existence. Now, she said, she could rest, or perhaps she could continue. She spoke of reincarnation not as a belief but as a process, something that happened whether we understood it or not. She said she hoped to return again, perhaps to Egypt, perhaps elsewhere. She said consciousness didn't end. It simply moved, taking its memories with it when conditions were right. Her funeral was small but meaningful. Local villagers came, people who had known the eccentric British woman who loved the old temple. A few archaeologists and researchers who had worked with her over the years attended. The Egyptian Department of Antiquities sent a representative, acknowledging her decades of service to the preservation and understanding of Egyptian cultural heritage. She was buried in a Coptic cemetery near Abydos, as close to the temple as the local authorities would allow. She had requested this burial location specifically. She wanted her body to rest near the place where Bentrashit had lived and died, creating a symmetry between these two lives she claimed to have experienced. On her gravestone there's a simple inscription in both English and hieroglyphs. The English reads, Dorothy Edie, Om Siti, 1904 to 1981, may she find her way home. The hieroglyphs say something similar, a prayer for safe passage through the afterlife realms. After her death, some of the archaeologists and researchers who had worked with Dorothy reflected publicly on their experiences with her. Their assessments were mixed, cautious, reluctant to claim anything too definitive. One researcher stated that Dorothy had been remarkably knowledgeable about ancient Egyptian temple culture, and that her insights had occasionally proven valuable in guiding excavations. Another noted that she'd possessed an unusual gift for understanding the religious and symbolic dimensions of Egyptian civilization. A third simply said that she had been devoted to her work and that her sincerity was never in question. None of them publicly endorsed the reincarnation hypothesis, but some admitted, in carefully worded statements, that they couldn't fully explain the source of Dorothy's knowledge through conventional means. They acknowledged that her case raised interesting questions about consciousness, memory, and the possibility of information transfer through mechanisms not yet understood by science. In the years since Dorothy's death, her story has been told and retold in various forms. Documentaries have been made, books have been written. She's become a minor figure in the literature on reincarnation claims, cited by believers as evidence that past life memories are real, and by skeptics as an example of how elaborate false memories can become. The archaeological work at Abydos has continued, with new discoveries being made regularly. Some of these discoveries have confirmed details that Dorothy mentioned decades earlier. Others have revealed features she never described, suggesting that her knowledge, whatever its source, was not complete. The Temple of Seti I still stands, a monument to one pharaoh's devotion to the gods and his own legacy. Tourists visit it regularly, walking through the same corridors that Dorothy claimed to remember, gazing at reliefs that Dorothy said she had seen being carved, standing in spaces that Dorothy insisted she had occupied in another life. Some of these tourists know Dorothy's story. They search for the spots she mentioned. They try to imagine what she experienced. They wonder whether her claims could possibly be true. Others know nothing about her and experience the temple purely as an archaeological site, impressive but remote, a relic of a civilization that died long ago. The question Dorothy's life poses has not been answered. If anything, it's become more complex as we've learned more about consciousness, memory, and the nature of identity. Modern neuroscience has mapped the brain in increasing detail, but it still can't fully explain how subjective experience arises from neural activity. Psychology has developed sophisticated models of memory and identity formation, But cases like Dorothy's still don't fit cleanly into those models. What we're left with is uncertainty and possibility. The uncertainty of not knowing conclusively whether Dorothy was remembering a genuine past life or experiencing an elaborate psychological phenomenon. The possibility that consciousness might be more than we currently understand, that memory might persist in ways we haven't yet discovered, that identity might extend beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. Dorothy's story asks us to consider these possibilities without insisting on definitive answers. It invites us to hold multiple interpretations simultaneously. Maybe she was right, maybe she was mistaken, maybe the truth is something neither option fully captures. And perhaps that invitation to uncertainty is the real value of her case. In a world that demands clear answers and confident explanations, Dorothy's story reminds us that some questions remain genuinely open. Some experiences don't fit neatly into existing frameworks. Some mysteries persist despite our best efforts to solve them. If reincarnation is real, if consciousness truly survives death and carries memories forward into new lives, it probably doesn't announce itself through undeniable miracles or incontrovertible proof. It probably manifests through cases like Dorothy's, ambiguous, compelling, evidential enough to make us wonder, but not conclusive enough to end debate. It appears in the child who insists they've lived before, who describes places they've never been and recognizes people they've never met. It appears in the adult who feels profound displacement, convinced that their true home exists somewhere or somewhen other than here and now. It appears in the rare individual whose memories seem to transcend the boundaries of their current existence, pointing backward toward experiences that shouldn't be accessible, but somehow are. Dorothy Eady was one of those individuals. She lived as though the past was present, as though memory could leap across centuries, as though consciousness was continuous even when bodies were not. She maintained this belief despite skepticism, mockery, and the practical difficulties it created in her life. She dedicated 7 decades to honouring a memory that either was real or felt so convincingly real that the distinction didn't matter to her, and in the end, she died where she wanted to die, near the temple she had never truly left, in the land she had always considered home. Was she right? Did Bentrashit really exist? Did Dorothy genuinely remember a life lived 3,000 years before her birth? We don't know. Perhaps we can't know, at least not with the tools and frameworks currently available to us. But we can know this. Dorothy lived her truth with absolute conviction. She followed her memories wherever they led, even when the destination was uncertain and the journey was difficult. She honoured what she believed with her entire life, asking nothing from others except the space to pursue her strange and singular path. And in doing so, she left us with a question that refuses to disappear, a mystery that continues to haunt and intrigue. What if the past is not gone? What if it lives on in those rare individuals who remember? What if consciousness carries forward, life after life, memory after memory, seeking to return to places and people it once knew? What if Dorothy was telling the truth all along? The temple at Abydos stands silent on these questions, its stones holding secrets that may never be fully revealed. The wind blows through the ancient columns as it has for thousands of years. The sun rises and sets over the desert as it always has. And somewhere in that timeless landscape, if Dorothy was right, the spirit of Bentrashit finally rests, her long exile ended, her memory vindicated, her love for a long-dead pharaoh acknowledged and honoured. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Dorothy simply lived an unusual life, shaped by psychological processes we don't entirely understand, finding meaning in beliefs that gave her comfort and purpose, even if they weren't factually accurate. Either way, her story endures, and as long as it endures, we'll continue to ask the question she raised, continue to wonder about the possibilities she represented, continue to grapple with the mystery of consciousness and the enigma of memory. Because in the end, Dorothy's story isn't just about one woman's claim to have lived before, it's about all of us, about our hunger for meaning and continuity, about our hope that we might be more than these brief, fragile lives, about our deep need to believe that somehow, in some way, the people we love and the places we cherish and the experiences that define us might persist beyond death. Dorothy believed they did, She staked her entire existence on that belief. And whether she was right or wrong, her conviction asks us to consider, what if she was onto something? What if the materialist model is incomplete? What if consciousness really does survive? What if we're not as alone, as temporary, as final, as we've been taught to believe? The answer remains uncertain. The mystery persists. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some questions are meant to stay open, keeping us humble about what we know and curious about what we don't. Dorothy's life was one long exploration of such a question. Her death didn't answer it, but it didn't erase it either. The question remains, waiting for each of us to consider it in our own time, in our own way. What if? Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most persistent mysteries, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's shadows. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. And a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting tonight's topic. This one goes deep. Now let's talk about a secret society that might have changed America forever. Picture this. It's late April in the year 1865. Richmond, Virginia, lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from buildings set ablaze during the evacuation. The Confederate capital has fallen, and Jefferson Davis, president of the dying Confederacy, is fleeing south with whatever remains of his government. In the chaos of that retreat, a train of wagons moves through the darkness, creaking under the weight of heavy cargo. The guards riding alongside are exhausted, but they stay alert. They know what they're protecting. Gold bars wrapped in canvas, silver coins in wooden chests, banknotes and bonds representing fortunes, the final treasury of the Confederate States of America, everything that remains of a nation that's bleeding to death. History tells us most of that gold was captured, stolen or lost during the desperate retreat. The official records are clear. The case is closed. The Confederate treasury was seized or scattered, and that's the end of it. But what if I told you that eyewitness accounts from that period tell a very different story? What if Union officers testified, under oath, that massive quantities of gold were never recovered? What if there was no clear chain of custody for millions of dollars worth of Confederate assets? What if the math simply doesn't add up, and nobody wants to talk about why? And what if the same name kept appearing in post-war rumours, whispered in backrooms and coded letters? A name that most history textbooks barely mention, if they mention it at all. A name that makes historians uncomfortable when you bring it up at academic conferences. The Knights of the Golden Circle. Tonight, we're going to explore one of America's most enduring conspiracy theories, a secret society that may have planned the Civil War, financed terrorism, and hidden a fortune that could still be buried somewhere in the American South. This isn't fiction. Every event I'm about to describe is documented. The only question is how the pieces fit together. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the secret society the Civil War never buried. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1854. Most Americans have never heard of Kansas, Nebraska. The Republican Party is brand new, formed just months earlier by anti-slavery activists who are horrified by the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, a man named George Washington Lafayette Bickley is about to change history in ways that are still being felt today. Bickley was a curious figure, and that's putting it mildly. Officially he was a physician, though his medical credentials were questionable at best. He claimed to have studied in Britain, but no records support this. He styled himself as a professor and academic, but universities had no record of employing him. What he really was, in modern terms, was a con artist, a propagandist, and what we might today call a political operative with dangerous ideas. But he had charisma. People who met him described a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a voice that could fill a room. He could talk for hours without notes, weaving elaborate visions of southern glory and manifest destiny. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to belong to something. They want to belong to something secret, something special, something that makes them feel chosen. In that year, Bickley founded a secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name wasn't poetic or symbolic. It was literal, and it was terrifying if you understood what it meant. Bickley envisioned a slave-holding empire that would stretch in a massive circle, 2,400 miles in radius, centered on Havana, Cuba. This golden circle would encompass the entire American South, all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. It would be, in Bickley's feverish vision, a paradise built on slave labour and southern aristocracy. An empire where wealthy white landowners would rule over millions of enslaved people, extracting unlimited wealth from sugar, cotton, and coffee plantations stretching from Virginia to Venezuela. The plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. Bickley didn't just have a vision, he had maps, he had economic projections, he had military strategies for conquering Mexico and Central America. He had calculated how many enslaved workers would be needed, how much profit could be generated, how the empire would be governed. It sounds insane. It was insane. But here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. People listened. Important people, wealthy people, powerful people. The Knights of the Golden Circle wasn't some fringe group meeting in basements and wearing silly hats. It was organised like a military operation from day one. The structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At the top were the castle leaders, men of wealth and influence who recruited members and organised local chapters. Below them were degrees of initiation, each requiring oaths, rituals, and the learning of secret codes in hand. Signals. Members didn't just join, they were initiated. The ceremonies involved darkness, candles, dramatic oaths sworn on weapons and symbols. New members were told they were joining something ancient and powerful, though in reality the organisation was barely older than they were. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of being part of a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a movement that was going to reshape the world. The knights learned coded language that allowed them to identify each other and communicate in plain sight. They used hand signs borrowed from Masonic traditions. They organised into local chapters called castles, each with its own treasury, meeting place, and roster of members, and they recruited aggressively, targeting men with influence, money, and military experience. By the year 1860, just 6 years after the organisation's founding, conservative estimates suggest the Knights had over 40,000 members across the South and border states. Some historians think the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60 or 70,000. They had infiltrated southern military units, state legislatures, railroad companies and banks. They had money, influence, and most importantly a plan. The KGC wasn't just talking about secession, they were preparing for it. They were stockpiling weapons, they were identifying targets, they were creating networks that could move information, money and people across state lines without detection. They were building an infrastructure for war before the war had even started. And here's what should really make you think. When the Civil War finally came, when the South seceded and the shooting started, Confederate leaders seemed remarkably prepared. Communication networks were already in place, supply lines had been thought through, sympathizers in northern states were already organized and ready to cause problems. How much of that preparedness came from the Knights of the Golden Circle? We'll never know for sure, but the timing is awfully convenient. Chapter 2. The Shadow War. When the Civil War finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, something strange happened to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Officially, publicly, the organisation dissolved. Newspapers that had occasionally mentioned the group suddenly stopped. Meeting halls went quiet. The Knights of the Golden Circle seemed to have vanished into history just as the conflict they had helped create was beginning. But Union intelligence reports tell a very different story. And these weren't conspiracy theories or rumours. These were official military intelligence documents, filed by commanders who were genuinely worried about what they were seeing. The Knights didn't disappear. They simply went underground and changed their names, the way a criminal might use an alias when the law gets too close. Some became the Order of American Knights. Others called themselves the Sons of Liberty, deliberately invoking Revolutionary War imagery to make their treason seem patriotic. Same members, same oaths, same goals, just different letterhead. And throughout the war, accusations followed them like a shadow that wouldn't be shaken off. Union authorities documented case after case of sabotage, particularly in the border states of Indiana, Ohio and Illinois. These weren't Confederate states, these were Union territory. But they were full of Southern sympathizers, and more importantly, they were full of Knights. Railroad tracks would be destroyed the night before major troop movements. How did the saboteurs know when trains would be passing? Telegraph lines would be cut at exactly the moments when Union commanders needed to communicate most urgently. Coincidence or inside information? Weapons shipments that should have reached Union armies mysteriously disappeared in transit. Where did those weapons go? Were they sold? Hidden? Sent south to Confederate forces? Draft resistance seemed too organised to be spontaneous. When the Union implemented conscription in 1863, riots erupted in multiple northern cities at almost the same time. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes an existing network of people willing to act together. Union commanders, particularly in the Western Theatre, became convinced they were fighting two wars simultaneously. One war against the Confederate Army in the South, which was difficult enough, and another war against a secret network operating in their own backyard, behind their own lines, sabotaging their efforts from within. The most dramatic case came in the summer of 1864 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Union authorities had been investigating suspected KGC activity for months. They were building a case, gathering evidence, identifying members, and in August they finally had enough to act. They arrested Harrison H. Dodd, identified as a high-ranking leader in what was now calling itself the Order of the American Knights. Dodd was a lawyer, a respected member of the community. He had money and connections. But Union investigators had evidence, they claimed, that he was planning something much bigger than simple draft resistance. The charges were staggering. Dodd was accused of planning to break Confederate prisoners out of northern prison camps and arm them for attacks on Union cities. The plan allegedly involved coordinating simultaneous uprisings in Indiana, Ohio and Illinois, timed to coincide with Confederate military operations in the South. The goal was nothing less than forcing the Union to fight a two-front war, to divide their forces and potentially tip the balance toward Confederate victory. If even half of these charges were true, it was one of the most ambitious plots of the entire war. Dodd was placed under heavy guard in Indianapolis, awaiting a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in his execution for treason. And then he escaped, just walked out, disappeared, vanished like smoke. The official explanation was embarrassingly vague. Guards were supposedly bribed or distracted. Dodd had help from someone obviously, but who, and where did he go afterward? Harrison H. Dodd was never found again. He didn't turn up dead. He wasn't captured later in the war. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record. A high-profile prisoner, accused of plotting massive domestic terrorism, just disappeared. How does that happen? How does a man awaiting trial for treason against the United States simply vanish in the middle of the largest war in American history? Who helped him? Where did he go? Did he flee to Confederate territory? Did he hide in plain sight under a new identity? Did he continue his activities from the shadows? The official records don't say. They can't say, because nobody knows. Or if anyone knew, they never told. But investigators at the time began to suspect something that would have been almost too frightening to admit publicly. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or whatever they were calling themselves now, hadn't been planning just for war. They had been planning for defeat. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a struggle that wouldn't end with military victory or defeat, but would continue for years, maybe decades afterward. They were preparing for the long game, and that meant they needed to survive as an organisation regardless of who won the war. Chapter 3. The Gold That Vanished. Let's go back to that night in April of 1865. Richmond, Virginia has fallen to Union forces. The Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, is now behind enemy lines. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over, at least for all practical purposes. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, is fleeing south with what remains of his cabinet. They're moving fast, trying desperately to reach Texas or Mexico before Union cavalry catches them. It's a sad end for a government that once controlled 11 states and fielded massive armies. Now it's reduced to a handful of officials and guards, riding through the night, hoping to outrun history. With them travels the Confederate treasury or what's left of it. Wagons loaded with boxes and barrels, guards posted at all times, everything that remains of a nation's wealth, being hauled down muddy roads in the darkness. On May 10th, 1865, Union troops finally catch up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The capture itself is almost anticlimactic. Davis, exhausted and despairing, is taken without a fight. Union officers search the camp and seize the assets they find. Some gold coins, some silver. Personal effects belonging to Davis and his family. They load it all up, document what they've captured, and send Davis north to imprisonment. Case closed. War over. The Confederate treasury has been recovered, except it hasn't. Not really. Because here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply suspicious. The amount of gold and silver seized at Irwinville didn't match Confederate financial records. Not even close. Not within several $1 million of close. Confederate ledgers indicated the government had received substantial foreign loans, particularly from British and French sympathisers who believed in the Southern cause and saw profit in supporting it. They had held massive payroll funds to pay Confederate soldiers and officers. They had controlled private assets from Southern banks and wealthy donors who had literally given their fortunes to the cause. Ships had run the Union blockade carrying gold. Bonds had been sold. Wealth had been concentrated. Where did it all go? Union authorities interrogated Davis and his associates extensively. They weren't gentle about it. They wanted answers. They needed answers. The American people were demanding answers. Where was the Confederate gold? The responses they got were vague, contradictory, or simply non-existent. Some prisoners claimed the money had been spent during the long retreat from Richmond to Georgia. Spent on what? Food? Supplies? With what they had to show for it. Others said it had been stolen by deserting soldiers in the chaos of the Confederate collapse. Possible, but that would mean finding huge amounts of gold on random deserters, and that didn't happen. A few witnesses gave a different explanation, and this one kept coming up in different interviews, from different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. They said the money had been distributed to various trusted officers with orders to hide it until the South could rise again. Hide it geographically. Spread it out. Make it impossible to find or seize all at once. That last explanation kept coming up. Hide it until the South could rise again. Not spend it. Not secure it. Hide it. As if defeat was not the end of the conflict, but merely an intermission. Witnesses later came forward with stories that gave texture to these vague explanations. A wagon train guarded by men in Confederate uniforms, splitting off from the main column near the Georgia-South Carolina border and heading into the wilderness. Where were they going? Nobody followed to find out. Gold bars being loaded onto mules in the dead of night while the main camp slept. Who ordered it? Who received it? Trusted officers receiving sealed orders from Davis himself and then disappearing into the countryside, never to rejoin the retreating government. And when investigators tried to track down these officers, tried to follow these leads, they hit walls. The men involved? Many were later identified as former Knights of the Golden Circle members, not suspected members, documented members whose names appeared on captured KGC membership rolls from earlier in the war. Southern bankers with secret affiliations who had managed the Confederacy's finances. Confederate intelligence officers who had spent the war running covert operations. These weren't random choices. These were men selected for a reason. Men who could keep secrets. Men who belonged to organizations that valued loyalty unto death. By 1866, barely a year after the war's end, rumours were spreading across the South like a fever. The gold was out there somewhere, buried in caches scattered across multiple states, hidden in caves known only to a few, divided among trusted guardians who had sworn oaths to protect it with their lives, and all of it allegedly marked with symbols, protected by coded maps, and defended by men who would kill to keep the secret. The treasure hunt had begun, and it would claim lives for decades to come. Chapter 4. Symbols in the Woods. Over the next several decades, something strange started happening across the American South. People began finding things in the woods, in their fields, carved into rocks on their property. Strange symbols, deliberate markings, messages from the past written in a language most people couldn't read. The symbols were consistent enough that researchers eventually compiled catalogues trying to decode them. Hearts with arrows pointing in specific directions, turtles with marks on their shells indicating numbers or distances, owls with one eye open, turkey tracks arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural, snakes forming circles or figure eights, all arranged in ways that suggested purpose, meaning, direction. These weren't random scratches made by bored travellers. These were carved with tools, positioned in relation to landmarks, often protected from weather by overhangs or deliberate placement. Someone had spent time on them. Someone had meant them to last. Someone had intended them to be found by people who would know what they meant. Were these markers pointing to buried Confederate gold? Or were they elaborate hoaxes created by con artists preying on Southern desperation and nostalgia? The problem with dismissing them as hoaxes is simple and disturbing. People who found these markers often died. Not eventually, not of old age, suspiciously, quickly, under circumstances that didn't quite add up. I'm not exaggerating for effect. There's a pattern in the historical record that's genuinely disturbing when you see it laid out. A farmer in rural Georgia finds a carved stone on his property while ploughing. It's got symbols he doesn't recognise, but they're clearly man-made and look old. He mentions it at church the following Sunday, excited about the possibility of finding treasure. 2 weeks later, he's found dead in the woods, supposedly from a hunting accident. Except he wasn't carrying a rifle. His rifle was found at home, so who shot him? A prospector in Arkansas discovers a map hidden in the lining of an old Confederate uniform he bought from a widow. The map shows landmarks he recognises, symbols he doesn't. He starts asking around town about the symbols, showing the map to people he trusts. His cabin burns down 3 weeks later with him inside. The fire inspector rules it an accident, despite finding evidence the door had been nailed shut from the outside. A family in Missouri begins digging in a suspicious location on their land after the grandfather claims he remembers Confederate soldiers burying something there during the war. They find a stone marker with KGC symbols. They dig deeper. Armed men arrive at their property one night, masked and carrying weapons. They order the family to stop digging, to forget what they've seen, and to never speak of it again. The family stops digging. They don't report it to the sheriff. When asked about it years later, they claim they don't remember what the armed men looked like or how many there were. They're terrified decades after the fact. The newspapers of the late 1800s are full of these stories, particularly in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky and Georgia. Local papers would run articles about mysterious deaths, strange intimidation and treasure hunting gone wrong. And here's the unsettling part. In most cases, local sheriffs didn't investigate thoroughly. Or if they did, the cases were quietly dropped without explanation. Why? What pressure was being applied? Who had enough influence in multiple states to make law enforcement back off repeatedly? The implication is obvious but terrifying. Someone was guarding something, and they had enough power, enough reach, enough organisational capability to intimidate local law enforcement in multiple states across multiple decades. That's not a random group of treasure hoarders. That's an organisation, a network, a conspiracy that functioned across state lines and across generations. In the 1890s, newspapers in Texas and Arkansas ran multiple stories about mysterious armed men forcing landowners to abandon property. These weren't robberies. The armed men didn't steal anything. They didn't want the land, they just wanted the residents gone, immediately and permanently. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave and don't come back. Some families complied. They packed up and left, abandoning property they'd owned for decades. Others tried to stand their ground and found themselves facing escalating harassment. Livestock killed, barns burned, warning shots fired at night. Eventually everyone left. Who were these men? What were they protecting? Were they remnants of the Knights of the Golden Circle, still operating decades after the Civil War? Were they descendants of the original knights, carrying on some kind of guardian tradition passed down through families? Were they hired muscle being paid by someone with resources and a vested interest in keeping certain areas undisturbed? Or were they something else entirely? Something that had evolved from the knights but wasn't quite the same? Organisation anymore? Chapter 5. From Knights to Clan. We need to talk about timing. And when I say we need to talk about it, I mean this is one of those historical coincidences that's almost too convenient to be a coincidence. December of 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee. Just 8 months after the war's end. 6 Confederate veterans are sitting around, bored and restless. The war is over. They lost. The world they knew is gone. The social order they fought to preserve is being dismantled by Reconstruction. They're young men with military training and no purpose, so they form a social club. At least that's what they claim it is. They're bored, they say. They want something to do. They create elaborate costumes, mysterious rituals, grandiose titles that sound impressive but mean nothing. They ride through town at night in sheets and hoods, pretending to be ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. It's all just pranks and theatre, they insist. They call themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name comes from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Interesting choice of words, isn't it? Circle. At first, it really did seem to be just a social club. Costumes and midnight rides. Pranks designed to startle freedmen and carpetbaggers. It was juvenile, offensive, but not yet organised violence. But within 2 years, something changed. The play acting stopped being play. The social club transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. A terrorist organisation dedicated to violently resisting Reconstruction and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation, assault and murder. The transformation was remarkably quick and remarkably organised. Local chapters appeared across the South almost simultaneously. They had uniform rituals, similar costumes and coordinated tactics. They operated with military precision. When they decided to target someone, the attacks would happen on the same night in multiple counties, making it impossible for limited law enforcement to respond effectively. This wasn't organic growth. This was activation of an existing network. The early Klan had a structure that looked awfully, disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied Confederate secret societies. Secret oaths sworn in darkness, coded language that allowed members to identify each other, local chapters operating independently but following central guidance, a hierarchical command system with elaborate titles, blood initiation ceremonies, penalties for breaking oaths that were clearly stated and genuinely frightening. Sound like anyone we've been talking about? Here's where conspiracy theorists get very interested, and honestly, their interest isn't entirely unjustified. Several early Klan leaders had documented ties to Confederate intelligence networks during the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first Grand Wizard, had commanded cavalry units that included known KGC members. He had experience with covert operations, raids behind enemy, lines, and the kind of decentralized command structure that secret organizations require. Other early Klan leaders had backgrounds in secret fraternal organizations. They knew how to create rituals that bound men together. They understood the psychology of secret societies, how shared secrets create loyalty stronger than law or conscience. And the Klan's rapid spread across the South followed patterns that looked less like spontaneous organization and more like activation of an existing network. It was as if someone had a list of trusted men in each county, men who could be relied upon to organize and lead, men who already knew how to operate in secret, men who had done this before. Could the Knights of the Golden Circle have simply rebranded again? Could the KGC's ideology, infrastructure, membership roles, and yes, hidden wealth have been absorbed into the Klan? There's no smoking gun, no document that says, "Dear Klan, love the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's our member list, our operational procedures, and some gold to fund your activities." Historical conspiracies rarely leave convenient paper trails, but the circumstantial evidence is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Both organizations had essentially identical goals: preserve Southern power structures, resist federal authority by any means necessary, and maintain racial hierarchies through violence if needed. Both used secret rituals and violent intimidation as their primary tools. Both operated through decentralized cells that were difficult for authorities to infiltrate or destroy. Both had support from local elites who provided protection and resources, and both had financial resources that seemed to exceed what you'd expect from their claimed origins. Where did the early Klan get its funding? Sheets and robes cost money, horses cost money, arms cost money. Coordinating across multiple states costs money. Someone was paying for all of this, and it wasn't membership dues from poor farmers. How did it spread so quickly across such a large geographic area? Who was coordinating the violence? Who was training local leaders? Who was providing the operational manuals that made different Klan chapters operate so similarly? The official histories don't have good answers to these questions. Maybe because the truth was too disturbing to admit. Maybe because acknowledging a direct link between the KGC and the Klan would have meant admitting that Reconstruction was facing an organised insurgency with deep roots and significant resources, not just random violence from sore losers. That would have been a terrifying admission for the federal government to make. It would have meant the Civil War hadn't really ended. It had just changed tactics. Chapter 6. The Lincoln Question. We have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the assassination at the theatre. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theatre in Washington, District of Columbia. The play is Our American Cousin, a comedy that's popular with wartime audiences looking for distraction. President Abraham Lincoln is in the presidential box with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. They're relaxed. The war is essentially over. Lincoln can finally breathe. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. He's an actor. He's been in this theatre many times. The staff knows him. Nobody stops him. He knows the play well enough to time his approach for a moment when the audience will be laughing, covering the sound of his entry. Booth shoots President Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln slumps forward, mortally wounded. He'll die the next morning, never regaining consciousness. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the landing, and shouts something the witnesses can't quite agree on. Then he limps out of the theatre and disappears into the Washington night. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth evades capture. Let that sink in. The most wanted man in America, having just committed the most significant assassination in the nation's history, manages to avoid capture for nearly 2 weeks. How? He moves through a network of safe houses. He crosses the Potomac River into Virginia. He finds people willing to hide him, feed him, treat his injuries. He has contacts, resources, and most importantly, a plan that extends beyond the assassination itself. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a lone madman. This was planned. This was coordinated. This had infrastructure behind it. Eventually, Union cavalry tracks Booth down to a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. They surround the barn. They demand his surrender. Booth refuses. The barn is set on fire to force him out. In the chaos and smoke, a shot rings out. Booth falls, mortally wounded. He dies a few hours later. The official story is that Sergeant Boston Corbett, acting against orders, shot Booth to prevent his escape. Corbett claimed divine instruction to fire. He was never punished. Some witnesses said it looked like Booth shot himself. The truth died with everyone in that barn. The official investigation concluded that Booth was part of a conspiracy, but a relatively small one. A handful of co-conspirators, all Confederate sympathizers, acting largely on their own initiative to strike a blow against the Union government. 8 people were arrested, tried and convicted. 4 were hanged. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. It never has been. Researchers have spent over a century and a half picking apart Booth's movements, his contacts and his resources, and some of what they've found is genuinely troubling, raising questions that official history has never satisfactorily answered. Booth had connections to known Confederate intelligence operatives, not suspected connections, documented ones. He had travelled to Canada in the months before the Yale assassination, where Confederate agents were known to be operating. He had money, more money than an actor should have had. Where did it come from? His escape route followed pathways that matched documented Underground Railroad routes used by Southern agents during the war. Not approximately, exactly. The same houses, the same contacts, the same methods. Someone had planned this route before, tested it, confirmed it would work. The safe houses that sheltered Booth weren't random Confederate sympathizers. They had ties to secret societies and organized Southern resistance networks. Some had connections, documented in later research, to men who had been Knights of the Golden Circle members before the war. And here's the really interesting part that conspiracy researchers focus on. The assistance network Booth used looked remarkably similar to the escape tactics attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war. The organisation, the security protocols, the way information was compartmentalised so that each link in the chain only knew the next step, not the whole plan. This is sophisticated tradecraft. This is how intelligence organisations operate. This isn't how a random group of angry Southerners would organise an assassination plot. Did the Knights help plan Lincoln's assassination? Did they provide Booth with resources, training and support? Were they part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government and create chaos that might somehow revive Confederate hopes? The conspiracy theorists point to several disturbing coincidences. The assassination happened just days after Lee's surrender, when Confederate cause was clearly lost. Why then? If it was about changing the war's outcome, it was too late. But if it was about revenge, or about creating a martyred president whose death would poison Reconstruction and benefit Southern resistance, then the timing makes perfect sense. Official investigations never proved KGC involvement. They never even seriously investigated it. But they also never fully ruled it out. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, and often destroyed or lost. What we're left with is a question mark, a big one. And the more you look at the details, the more you notice the gaps in the official story, the bigger that question mark becomes. Chapter 7. The 20th Century Ghosts. You might think that by the 1900s the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ancient history, a relic of the Civil War era, as dead as the Confederacy itself, something that belonged in dusty archives and academic dissertations, not in the living world. But strange things kept happening. Little things, easily dismissed individually but disturbing when you see them as a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, occasional reports surfaced that didn't quite make sense. Men in small southern towns identifying themselves as knights to people they thought they could trust. Why would anyone claim membership in a defunct organisation unless it wasn't actually defunct? Old Confederate symbols appearing in unexpected places, carved into the foundations of new buildings, or incorporated into business logos in ways that seemed deliberately coded. Bank records tied to defunct southern trusts that seemed to have more money than they should, funds that appeared to grow over time rather than depleting. In 1934, something happened in Oklahoma that encapsulates the entire mystery. A man named William, a carpenter and amateur historian, was renovating an old house that had supposedly been built by a Confederate veteran. He was tearing out a wall when he found something hidden in the cavity between the studs. A map, hand-drawn on aged paper, sealed in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The map showed local landmarks, some of which still existed, others that William had to research to identify, and it was covered in symbols, hearts, turtles, owls, the same symbols that had been appearing on treasure maps and stone markers for 70 years. William was excited. He was careful. He didn't immediately announce his find to the world. He showed it to a few trusted friends. He started researching the symbols, trying to decode them. He planned an expedition to some of the marked locations. He was methodical, thoughtful, doing everything right. 3 weeks later, William was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no family history of heart problems. He'd been working in his garage when it happened, apparently. Alone. No witnesses. The map disappeared. When William's widow looked for it among his possessions, it was gone. She knew he'd been keeping it in a locked drawer in his workshop. The drawer was still locked. The map wasn't there. She never reported it missing. When researchers tried to interview her years later about her husband's death, she refused to discuss it. She was afraid, decades after the fact. You could see it in her eyes, people said. She was still afraid. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the century. Someone finds something, maybe an old map, maybe a journal, maybe carved symbols on their property. They get excited, they tell people, they start investigating. Then suddenly they don't want to talk anymore. Or they can't. In 1957, a man in Arkansas claimed he'd found a carved stone with KGC symbols while clearing land. He brought it to the local historical society, excited to share his discovery. The society photographed it, documented it, and asked if they could keep it for further study. He agreed. 2 weeks later, he returned and demanded the stone back, visibly shaken. The society returned it. He destroyed it with a sledgehammer in the parking lot, then left and never spoke of it again. Historical Society members later said he looked terrified, like someone had put a genuine fear into him. In 1973, a construction crew in East Texas accidentally uncovered what appeared to be a small buried vault while excavating for a shopping centre foundation. Inside were Confederate coins, personal effects, and documents. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid. The crew foreman called the site supervisor. The supervisor made some phone calls. Within hours, men in suits arrived and took control of the site. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, and were given substantial bonuses to ensure their silence. The vault and its contents disappeared. The shopping centre was built. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the artefacts or who those men in suits were. The treasure hunters who survived these encounters learned an important lesson. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media, though that didn't exist for most of this history. You don't give interviews. You don't write books. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land, and you hope nobody asks too many questions. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why this particular cache has gone undiscovered for over 100 years. Why no one else has found it, and whether maybe, just maybe, it was left unfound for a reason. Whether someone is still keeping track, still watching, still guarding secrets their great-great-grandfathers swore to protect. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades, the ones who are still alive and still willing to talk, they all tell similar stories. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match documented KGC codes. The location makes historical sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a friendly local who warns them the property owner is litigious. Could be someone claiming to represent historical preservation interests. Could be people who don't bother with explanations, who just make it very clear through body language and implication that moving along would be the smart choice. It happens too often to be coincidence, too consistently across too many years in too many locations to be random chance. Chapter 8. The Gaps That Remain Here's the fundamental problem with the Knights of the Golden Circle story, and it's a problem that should bother anyone who values historical truth. We know they existed. That's not in dispute. We have membership rolls recovered from raids during the Civil War. We have meeting minutes captured by Union forces. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their activities. We have court documents from wartime trials of suspected members. The Knights of the Golden Circle were real. We know they were large, well-organised, and had significant influence in southern and border states. That's also thoroughly documented. Estimates of 40 to 60,000 members aren't wild speculation. They're based on captured documents, testimony from defectors, and Union intelligence reports compiled by people with no reason to exaggerate. We know they had money. Membership dues, sure, but also backing from wealthy southern planters and businessmen who saw the organisation as serving their interests. They had the resources to publish newspapers, fund expeditions, and maintain a network of meeting halls across multiple states. What we don't know is what happened to them after the war, and that gap in the historical record isn't just suspicious, it's gaping. It's the kind of hole that swallows entire conspiracy theories, and still has room for more. Most KGC documents were destroyed. Whether deliberately or through the chaos of war, the organisation's records largely vanished. We're not talking about a few missing ledgers. We're talking about entire archives that should exist but don't. Membership rolls that should list thousands of names just gone. Financial records that should show where money came from and where it went disappeared. Correspondence that should reveal the organisation's plans and operations destroyed or lost. Confederate files were burned as Richmond fell. That's documented. The Confederate government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But which documents were considered most sensitive? Which were prioritised for destruction? Were KGC files among them? We don't know, because the records of what was destroyed were also destroyed. Post-war America had powerful reasons to bury the past and move forward. The country was exhausted, hundreds of thousands dead, the economy shattered, the social order completely upended. There was a genuine, understandable desire to just stop fighting and start rebuilding. Admitting that a large, well-funded secret society had survived the war and might still be operating would have been devastating to that effort. It would undermine everything Reconstruction was trying to accomplish. It would expose federal failures to control domestic threats. It would raise uncomfortable questions about missing Confederate assets and who might have access to them. It would suggest that the war hadn't really ended, just changed forms. So the official story became simple, clean, reassuring. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a pre-war conspiracy that faded away when their dreams of a southern empire died at Appomattox. They disbanded. Their members went home. Some joined other organisations like the Klan, but the KGC itself ceased to exist. End of story. Clean, simple, reassuring. Probably not true. Because here's what doesn't make sense about that narrative. Organisations don't usually announce when they disband, especially secret organisations. They don't take out newspaper ads saying the Knights of the Golden Circle are officially dissolved, thank you for your support. They just go quiet. And going quiet doesn't mean ceasing to exist. It just means becoming invisible. And there's another problem with the official narrative. The Knights had been planning for Confederate defeat since at least 1863, possibly earlier. There's evidence of this in captured correspondence. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a protracted struggle. They were hiding resources and building networks designed to survive military defeat. Why would an organisation that had spent years preparing for defeat suddenly give up the moment defeat actually came? That's not how groups work, especially groups built on ideology and bound by blood oaths. The more logical explanation is that they did exactly what they'd been planning to do. They went underground, they protected their resources, they waited, and maybe, just maybe, they're still waiting. Chapter 9. The question that won't die. Let's lay out what we know for certain. The Knights of the Golden Circle existed as a large organised secret society before and during the Civil War. Fact. Large amounts of Confederate gold and assets disappeared at the end of the war with no clear accounting. Fact. Treasure markers and coded symbols appeared across the South in the decades following the war. Fact. People who investigated these markers often met with mysterious deaths or intimidation. Fact. The early Ku Klux Klan emerged with a structure and spread pattern that resembled earlier Confederate secret societies. Fact. What we don't know is how these facts connect, and that's where it gets interesting. If the Knights of the Golden Circle really did plan for Confederate defeat, if they really did hide massive wealth, if they really did embed themselves into post-war American society, then we have to ask some uncomfortable questions. How long did they survive? What did they become? Did they evolve into something else? Or did they eventually fade away? If the gold still exists, who's guarding it now? And here's the most disturbing possibility. What if they never went away at all? What if the Knights of the Golden Circle simply learned to operate in the shadows, influencing events without drawing attention, maintaining their network across generations? Secret societies don't usually announce when they disband. They just stop being visible. That doesn't mean they stop existing. Chapter 10. The evidence in the ground. There's a reason treasure hunters are still looking for KGC gold, and it's not just fantasy or delusion or the appeal of a romantic mystery. Real discoveries have been made. Documented discoveries. The kind that make it into newspapers and legal proceedings because people have to figure out who owns what and how much tax is owed. In the 1980s, a man in Arkansas whose name was never publicly released found a cache of gold coins buried on property he'd recently purchased. The coins were genuine Civil War-era gold, worth a small fortune even at face value, worth much more to collectors, and they were buried in a very specific pattern, arranged in a way that matched documented KGC symbols. This wasn't random. This wasn't some Confederate soldier burying his pay. This was organised, intentional, and coded. The man did everything right legally. He reported the find to authorities. He paid taxes on the value. He worked with archaeologists to document the site properly. And then he never said another word about where exactly he found it, or what else might be out there. When reporters tried to follow up, he refused all interviews. When treasure hunters tried to trace the location based on public records, they hit dead ends. The man knew what he'd found, reported enough to stay legal, and then sealed his mouth shut. Why? What did he know? What did he suspect? Did someone approach him? Did he figure out on his own that staying quiet was the smart choice? In the 1990s, a construction crew in Texas, working on a highway expansion project, accidentally uncovered a stone vault. This wasn't a treasure hunter's fantasy. This was heavy equipment operated by workers who didn't care about Civil War history. They just wanted to finish the job and go home. The vault was about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, sealed with mortar that had held for over a century. Inside, they found Confederate currency, personal effects including letters and a diary, and various items that indicated this had been buried by someone with means and connections. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid, not painted, not scratched, carved deep, meant to last, meant to identify to those who knew the code. The contents were turned over to local historians and eventually ended up in a museum collection. But here's the interesting part. The exact location of the find was never publicly disclosed. The construction records show a general area, but not specific coordinates. When asked why, state officials cited concerns about treasure hunters and site preservation. But the site was under a highway. There was no site left to preserve. What were they really protecting? These aren't urban legends. These are documented finds with paperwork, witnesses and physical artefacts, which means the rumours weren't all fantasy. Something really was buried out there. The question is, how much and who knows where? In 2007, a metal detecting hobbyist in Kentucky found a sealed mason jar containing gold coins and a document on private property with the owner's permission. The document was a letter, dated 1866, with what appeared to be coded instructions. The letter referenced the circle and mentioned that what is buried shall remain until the time is right. The gold coins alone were worth over $30,000. The letter has never been fully decoded, though several cryptographers have tried. The finder split the proceeds with the property owner as agreed. They both signed non-disclosure agreements at the advice of their lawyers, which seems like an odd thing to do over a jar of old coins unless someone was worried about something more than taxes. And here's something that should make you think. In almost every documented case of KGC-related treasure being found, the finders either stay quiet afterward or face mysterious pressure to stop looking, stop talking, stop investigating. It's not every time. Some people find old coins and that's the end of it. But when the find includes KGC symbols, when it appears to be part of a larger pattern, when it suggests there's more out there, that's when things get strange. That's when people start getting careful about what they say. Chapter 11. The Map That Can't Be Read. Here's something that genuinely haunts researchers who study the KGC. Something that keeps them up at night turning over possibilities in their minds. Authentic treasure maps allegedly created by the Knights do exist in various museums and private collections across the South. They've been authenticated as period documents by multiple experts. The paper is right, matching paper stock from the 1860s. The ink is right, consistent with iron gall ink used during the Civil War era. The handwriting matches known Confederate styles and shows the characteristic flourishes of educated men from that period. These aren't obvious forgeries created by modern hoaxers. These are genuine 19th century documents, but they can't be read. And that's the problem that's driven cryptographers and treasure hunters to distraction for over a century. The maps use a cipher system that has never been fully cracked. Symbols that might represent landmarks, distances or directions, but without a key, without the code book or verbal instructions that would have been passed between members, they're just intricate drawings. Beautiful, precise, maddeningly useless drawings. Some researchers have spent entire careers trying to decode these maps. They've applied every known cipher technique from the 1800s. They've tried substitution ciphers, where each symbol represents a letter or number. They've tried transposition ciphers, where the symbols need to be rearranged according to a pattern. They've tried book ciphers, where the symbols might reference specific words in well-known texts like the Bible or Shakespeare. Nothing works completely. They can make educated guesses. They can extrapolate based on geographical knowledge and historical context. They can sometimes identify what might be a church or a river or a crossroads, but they can't definitively read the maps from start to finish. They can't follow the instructions the way the original Knights would have. And here's what makes it even more frustrating. The cipher system appears to be multi-layered. Some symbols seem to be straightforward landmarks. A church might be indicated by a cross, a river by wavy lines. But then other symbols are clearly coded, and the code itself might vary from map to map, suggesting that different castles or different members use different variants of the base system. It's brilliant security when you think about it. Even if someone captured a map, even if they understood that it led to buried treasure, they couldn't follow it without additional knowledge. Knowledge that would have been passed down verbally from member to member, perhaps through the initiation rituals or through private instruction from castle leaders to their most trusted subordinates. It's the perfect security system for its time. A treasure map that requires human knowledge to interpret. Knowledge that might have died with its keepers as the organisation aged, and members passed away without proper successors. Or knowledge that might still be held by someone somewhere who knows exactly what they're protecting and why. And here's the really interesting thing that comes up when you talk to modern cryptographers who've worked on these maps. They say the cipher system shows signs of being deliberately designed to be unbreakable without the key. It's not just complex. It's structured in a way that prevents pattern analysis from working. The symbols don't repeat in predictable ways. There aren't enough examples to do frequency analysis. It's as if whoever designed the system understood the principles of cryptography well enough to build in defences against the standard code-breaking techniques. Where did a group of Southern conspirators in the 1850s and 60s get that kind of expertise? Some members had military training, sure, but this is more sophisticated than military field codes of that era. Some researchers speculate that KGC leaders studied European secret society traditions, borrowing techniques from groups like the Freemasons or even older organisations. Or maybe they just had someone in the organisation who was genuinely brilliant at creating codes, someone whose identity we'll never know because the records burned with Richmond. Chapter 12. The Modern Search. Today, there's a subculture of treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy enthusiasts who are still looking for KGC gold. They compare notes online, they share theories, they make expeditions into remote areas of the South with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Most find nothing. Some find bottles and old nails. A few find things they won't talk about publicly. Because here's what they've learned. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media. You don't give interviews. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why no one else has found this in over 150 years, and whether maybe it was left unfound for a reason. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades tell the same story. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match. The location makes sense. They'll plan an expedition, and then someone shows up. Could be a local property owner, could be someone claiming historical preservation concerns, could be people who just make it clear they should move along. It happens too often to be coincidence. Final chapter. What if it's true? Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say everything the conspiracy theorists claim is true. The Knights of the Golden Circle survived the Civil War. They hid massive amounts of Confederate wealth. They evolved, adapted, and maintained their organisation across generations. What would that mean? It would mean there's a secret society, over 150 years old, sitting on a fortune in gold and historical artefacts. It would mean they've successfully stayed hidden while the world changed completely around them. It would mean they've passed down knowledge, rituals and responsibilities through multiple generations. It would mean they're still out there. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's what some people believe happened. And the reason they believe it is because the alternative explanations have gaps you could drive a truck through. Where did the Confederate gold go? It was lost doesn't really answer the question when witnesses say it was deliberately hidden. Why do treasure markers appear across the South? It's a hoax doesn't explain why people keep dying when they find them. How did the early Klan spread so quickly with such sophisticated organisation? Confederate veterans is a vague answer that doesn't account for the resources involved. The official history has gaps. The conspiracy theory fills those gaps. Maybe not correctly, but it fills them with a narrative that's at least coherent. Epilogue. The truth we'll never know. Here's what I believe after researching this topic for hours and hours, after reading everything I could find, after talking to treasure hunters and historians and people who've spent their lives chasing these shadows. The Knights of the Golden Circle were absolutely real. They were large, influential and genuinely dangerous. They absolutely played a significant role in pushing the South toward a secession and supporting the Confederate cause during the Civil War. That's not speculation. That's documented historical fact. I also believe that Confederate gold was deliberately hidden at the end of the war. Not all of it. Probably not even most of it. A lot of Confederate wealth really was lost to chaos, stolen by deserters, or seized by Union forces. But significant amounts, meaningful amounts, were deliberately cached by people who hoped and believed the South would rise again and need those resources. This also isn't wild speculation. We have witness testimony, we have documented discoveries, we have too many consistent accounts across too many years to dismiss it all as fantasy. Were those people members of the KGC? Probably some of them were. The KGC was the most organised, most sophisticated secret society in the Confederacy. They had the structure, the discipline, and the ideology to carry out long-term plans. It makes perfect logical sense they'd be involved in any plan to hide assets and prepare for a protracted resistance. Did they survive as an organisation after the war? That's where it gets murky, where the facts blur into speculation and possibility. I think elements of the KGC probably did persist for a while, maybe even for decades. The infrastructure was there, the ideology was there, the motivation was certainly there. Organisations don't just evaporate when they lose a war, especially organisations built on blood oaths and shared secrets. But did they maintain the same structure and goals as the war years? Did they evolve into something else, something adapted to the changed reality of post-war America? Did they eventually just fade away as members died, and their secrets died with them, as the world changed too much for their antebellum dreams to make any sense? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the frustrating and fascinating thing about this story. What I do know is that treasure hunters are still finding things, not in huge numbers, but consistently enough that it can't all be dismissed. Symbols are still carved in stone across the south, weathered but visible if you know where to look, and people who know the history, who've studied it deeply, still get uncomfortable when you start asking questions about certain locations. There's still something there, whether it's actual buried gold or just the cultural memory of secrets that were real once. I can't say for certain. Something happened in the 1860s. The evidence is there in archives and museums. The gaps in the historical record are there in what's missing from those same archives. The unanswered questions are there in every documentary find that raises 10 new questions. Maybe the truth is mundane. A bunch of Confederate sympathizers buried some gold with the best of intentions. They drew maps and carved markers, but time passed. They died. Their children didn't care about the old cause. The markers eroded. Development covered burial sites. The treasure either doesn't exist in meaningful quantities anymore, or is lost forever, buried under highways and shopping centres and suburban sprawl. That's one possibility. It's a reasonable possibility. It might even be the truth. Or maybe the truth is stranger. Maybe there really is a network of guardians, not an organised secret society like the original Knights, but a tradition passed down through certain families. Knowledge that great-great-grandfather was trusted with something important. A sense of duty to protect what was hidden, even if the original cause is long dead and the gold itself matters less than the principle of keeping faith with the past. I can't tell you which it is. I can only tell you that the Knights of the Golden Circle definitely existed. They had the means, motive, and opportunity to hide Confederate wealth. They planned for defeat and prepared for a long struggle, and over a century and a half later, people are still looking for what they left behind, still finding markers and symbols, still encountering mysteries that resist easy explanation. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery itself is the legacy. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories, but the reminder that history has gaps, that the official story is often incomplete, that there are always secrets just beneath the surface of what we think we know. Closing thoughts. Were the Knights of the Golden Circle just a failed Confederate relic? A historical footnote about Southern extremists who dreamed too big and lost? Or were they America's first true underground power network? An organisation that planned for the long game, that hid resources and embedded themselves so deeply in post-war society that they became invisible? And if the gold still exists, sitting in caves or buried under farmland or hidden in places no one has looked for 150 years, who's guarding it now? Is it still being guarded at all? Or has time finally won, and the secrets of the Knights of the Golden Circle died with the last generation that knew them? I don't have answers, just questions. And the more you dig into this story, the more questions you'll have too. So maybe that's the real legacy of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories. Just questions that won't die, gaps in history that won't be filled, symbols carved in stone that no one alive can fully interpret, and treasure hunters still walking into the woods, looking for something that might not want to be found. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most persistent mysteries, please consider supporting the channel. Use those hype points. Leave that Spotify review. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We genuinely love seeing where this content reaches, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. We've got more stories like this coming, more gaps in history that need exploring, more questions that deserve to be asked. Until next time, sleep well. And if you're ever hiking in the Georgia wilderness and you see a stone with a turtle carved into it, maybe just keep walking. Some secrets have stayed buried this long for a reason. Good night.